Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. Over the past year, I've made a series of videos covering some of the most noteworthy cars in Gran Turismo's long history. But why exactly did I do this? Well, of course the cars are a crucial part to any racing game, but I've always believed that the cars in Gran Turismo can have as much personality as the characters in other games. It all stems from how each model of car is used in the game, what it represents, and how we as players interpret all of that. Through this process, the Gran Turismo community has created numerous legends. Whether it be one of the widely recognized icons of the series, a lesser known model that left a lasting impression, or even a car that became a running joke for whatever reason. They all have an interesting legacy in this series. Today, I've compiled each of my videos covering these various types of cars to create the Gran Turismo Car Files. If you're looking for a particular car in this video, make sure to check the description for timestamps. With all of that said, please sit back, relax, and enjoy. Gran Turismo memes are not funny, which is exactly why they're so funny. The thing is though, from looking at these memes from the GT community, a lot of them don't really make any sense, even if you're very familiar with the games. But saying that would somewhat be missing the point. Part of the reason why these memes became so memorable is the fact that they exist in the first place. I think Dustin Eden said it the best in the sense that Gran Turismo often takes itself so seriously that any abnormality that's picked up on can then be memed very easily, no matter how mundane it seems by regular meme standards. I mean, who looks at, say, a car spinning in the dealership and thinks, now this has potential?
I will now perform my people's native dance.
Well, someone did. And that's really the beauty of Gran Turismo memes, whether it's a popular meme format with GT applied to it, a music mashup, a shitpost, cursed images, or even meme mods for the games themselves. In fact, looking at so many of these memes whilst doing research for this video, I was even inspired to make my own. The link will be on screen if you're interested in that. But an element that I've always been really fascinated by is the cars within Gran Turismo that become memes. Gran Turismo has featured literally thousands of cars over the years, but only a specific few ever get the privilege of becoming memes. This can come in many forms. Some are fairly self-explanatory, and others can just seem like innocuous cars that aren't really out of place in a game like Gran Turismo. And that's where I come in. Today we're going to take a look at these cars, understand their meme origins, and provide a bit of context to their existence within Gran Turismo. So, buckle the fuck up, because you're gonna need to. We're really starting off swinging, aren't we? The Daihatsu Midget comes under a specific tier of meme cars, which I like to call Just Look At It. So named because, well, you can see why. Beyond just its looks, this K-Truck has the performance to back it up. 33 of your finest BHP, and 0 to 60 miles an hour in eventually. Yeah, beyond being one goofy boy, there really isn't a lot to the Daihatsu Midget being a meme. But the story doesn't end there. The Daihatsu Midget, despite its appearance, actually has a fairly decent legacy within Gran Turismo, first featuring back in Gran Turismo 2 and appearing in 4 more games after that. Here are some fun facts courtesy of the Gran Turismo wiki. In GT2, the Midget is the least powerful, fully upgraded car in the game with 66 brake horsepower. That may not sound like much, but when you consider that is double its stock horsepower, that's actually pretty impressive. One of the Midget's most distinctive features is that it's technically a pickup truck. Despite this, back in Gran Turismo 4, it for some reason was not allowed entry to the sports truck race. My guess is that Polyphony were worried it would be too overpowered and would easily blast past the Toyota Tacomas and Ford F-150s. The good news is that in Gran Turismo 5, it is allowed entry in the pickup truck challenge. So, go out there and have some fun on the Daytona Super Speedway. That can't go wrong. The Midget is also notable for being one of the cheapest cars in Gran Turismo history. In GT4, you could find it in the used dealers for just over $3,000. What a bargain. Also worth mentioning that it's even had a couple of one-make race events. Firstly, the incredibly named Midget Contest from GT2, and then again in GT4 with the Midget 2 race. Your prize for winning that event? The original Daihatsu Midget from 1963. This model sadly only appeared in GT4, much like the Benz patent motor wagon, and just like the Benz, it had only 3 wheels. This meant it was classed as a special car and so couldn't be used in any events. This is also the most likely reason why it didn't return for GT5 and beyond. Still, you can always go back to GT4 to enjoy its 12 brake horsepower performance and 0 to 60 time of never. The second car in our Just Look at It category is the Chrysler Phaeton, or according to Gran Turismo, the Dodge Chrysler Phaeton. Again, just visually speaking, it's not hard to understand why this one became a meme. Wow. Just wow. But aside from that, in every other sense, it's pretty much the exact opposite of the Midget, a massive V12 barge which should never go within 10 miles of a racetrack. But despite that, it's actually surprisingly fast. Like the Midget, it did also debut on GT2, but to date that's been its only appearance in the series, so it doesn't have much of a legacy beyond the meme. If you want to, you can obtain it by winning the 3rd race of the Muscle Car Cup. I appreciate Polyphony's sense of humour. You know, for all the talk about the GT4 randomizer that recently came out, who really needs it when you have GT2? The best randomizer. No mods required. We're going back to Daihatsu and the world of K-cars. The Daihatsu Copen is the first specific event meme car. That is to say, it's a meme because of one specific event that it appears in, that being the first coffee break event in the B license of GT4. Coffee breaks were small challenges placed in the middle of each license that were meant to be a fun distraction and break up the monotony of the license tests, but the joke is that they were often a lot harder and more frustrating than the tests themselves. Even though it only appears in the first one, the Copen has become the unofficial car of the coffee breaks. There were 5 of them in GT4, which involved either avoiding cones or deliberately knocking them down. They returned once more in GT6, where alongside the usual cone shenanigans, there were also eco challenges, where you had to drive a certain distance on limited fuel, and drift trials as well. But whenever anyone mentions coffee breaks, the first thought in any Gran Turismo fan's mind are the ones from GT4, and most likely the first one with the Copen. Given the cafe menu book disaster from GT7, you could argue at this point that Gran Turismo and cafe related things should never be put together. Although I've never been to the real life Gran Turismo cafe, so maybe that's the exception. So the Copen is pretty much a meme by circumstance. Other than that, it's a fairly unremarkable K sports car. But that isn't the whole story. With the release of GT Sport came a new Copen, the Copen RJ. RJ standing for Racing Jacket. Despite the goofy name, it is an interesting car, taking a 2nd generation Copen and juicing it up to make a proper performance car. However, despite its appearance, it's actually a Vision GT car. This ultimately means that, like a lot of Vision GTs, it's ridiculously overpriced, has limited tuning, and no actual purpose within the game. What's interesting though is that unlike any other Vision GT, there was no trailer made for it, and in-game it didn't even have a description in GT Sport, making it one of, if not the only car in the game to not have one. Also, it appears as though the design wasn't even done by Daihatsu, but rather outsourced to another company. The car just seemed to appear from nowhere, a strange situation indeed. Although it's not often talked about, the Copen RJ is a meme in my heart at least. Also, can we mention how despite some K cars like the Copen being featured in the coffee breaks, the Suzuki Cappuccino has never been used in one, ever. That blew my mind. Maybe it was too obvious. If it ever had, I have no doubts in my mind that it would be the meme car to represent the coffee breaks instead of the Copen. All in all, I think Colorshed Productions summed up the situation the best when he said, "If I want a coffee break, I'll turn the game off." Never a truer word has been spoken before. And I don't even drink coffee. The second of our event-specific meme cars is the Mercedes SLR Mclaren. Alongside coffee breaks, GT4 also introduced driving missions, races for you to win under specific conditions. The final few of these were known as one-lap magic, and involved your opponents driving slower cars and being given a head start, with your goal to overtake them in the limited time available. The last driving mission in GT4 is Mission 34, where you're tasked with overtaking various other Mercedes models in the SLR. This mission is infamous for its difficulty, with a fairly strict time limit and taking place at the Nürburgring Nordschleife, the longest and most difficult track in the game. That alone is a recipe for frustration and is why many people consider it to be one of the toughest events in Gran Turismo history. But it gets worse. You see, the lead car, a Mercedes 300 SL, is given a more than 2-minute head start, and like all the other one-lap magic missions, you have to sit there and wait in real time, watching all the other cars leave the grid until it's finally your turn, meaning that if you make a mistake and have to restart, it's a more than 2-minute wait until you get your next attempt. It's excruciating and incredible that no one at Polyphony saw this as a problem. In fact, in Gran Turismo 7, where the one-lap magic missions return, they still make you sit through the full countdown, proving that they learnt exactly nothing. And yes, in case you're wondering, we are going to sit here and watch the full countdown. No, I'm not just padding for time, I believe that it's important so that you can understand the true pain and suffering of every person who's had to do the same thing when restarting this mission. But that does mean I need to fill time. So, how's it going? Are you enjoying the video so far? It's been a lot of fun for me to make, so if you are, please leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more. So, yeah, what have you been up to? I just finished playing through GT3 a couple of weeks ago, you might have seen. That was a lot of fun. Now I'm going to play through all the other games, starting with GT1. So that's going to be a good time, until I get to this mission in GT4 anyway. Yeah, I've been meaning to fully play through them all for a while now, but now making videos I pretty much have to for some of the stuff I've got planned in the future. So yeah, stay tuned for those. That's sure to be exciting. Don't know what more to say. What did I have for lunch? Yeah, I had a cheese sandwich for lunch. That was good. It's what I normally have. You know, it's quick and easy. Easy, simple, fills me up. You know, on white bread. Not a fan of brown bread. You know, wholemeal. That's not. Me and wholemeal don't really get along. So yeah, that's pretty much what I have most days, to be honest. You know, same thing really. Okay, let's race. That was pretty painful, but the good news is that if you were playing on the PAL version, the mission is a bit easier, as instead of waiting 123 seconds, you've only got to bear a mere 115 seconds. How generous. Okay, now this is where things start to get interesting. Gran Turismo memes are a relatively new concept. Sure, cars like the Daihatsu Midget were always joked about, but these ideas were never as widespread as they are today through internet memes. For my money, the first true Gran Turismo meme to originate within the game itself is the Pink Vitz. Just a note, in PAL regions, the Toyota Vitz is known as the Toyota Yaris. As the meme is Pink Vitz, I'll be referring to it as the Vitz. So this meme dates all the way back to 2011, predating the current Gran Turismo meme era, which started in around 2018-2019. A YouTuber by the name of Rhino GT4 was doing a playthrough of Gran Turismo 3. During this playthrough, he encountered the Pink Vitz. Then he encountered another Pink Vitz. And then another. And then, finally, its brother, the Cyan Vitz. What made this so funny was his initial reaction to seeing the Pink Vitz for the first time.
Ew. It's pink. It's a Toyota Vitz. It's pink. Why is it pink?
It's almost as if the game was punishing him for that. If I'm being honest, I don't mind the Pink Vitz. I think this shade of pink is alright. Of course, Rhino doesn't, which is why this meme got so much traction. I can't imagine the Cyan Vitz meme taking off in the same way, for example, but it's not really about that. It's more what the Pink Vitz represents. To take this slightly off topic, I've said many times that GT3 is my favourite Gran Turismo, and that's true, but like many things, it's not perfect. What I find funny is how the Pink Vitz meme is related in some way to every major issue I have with GT3. Let me explain. So the first way, and only guaranteed way of getting the Pink Vitz, is the Beginner League FF Challenge. This taps into one issue with GT3 already, which is that to begin with, it doesn't really feel like you're making much progress, since the prize cars you often get are worse than the car you would need to have to win the event anyway, such as in this case. But at least you can then use it for the Beginner Vitz Race Championship. But upon winning that championship, your 4 possible prize cars are all the Toyota Vitz, the car you would already need to have to even enter the championship. And one of those 4 possible Vitz is the Pink Vitz, which you probably would already have. Special colour prize cars were always a thing in the first 4 Gran Turismos. Since cars couldn't be repainted, there would be certain special colour variants that could be won from various events. GT3 has a few of them, but somehow there are 4 special colour variants of the Vitz. Why? Who would want these? And this is why there are so many opportunities to win the Vitz, so that you have the chance to collect every special colour. In the Amateur League, you then have a 2 out of 4 chance of winning one of them from the Altezza Championship as well. Then we get to the Professional League. One of the big issues with the Professional League is the number of one-make championships, long 10-lap races with fairly slow cars. And wouldn't you know it, the Vitz race is back again. And not only that, but out of the 5 races, 3 of them take place at the 3 longest tracks in the game: Grand Valley, Special Stage Route 11, and the Test Course Oval. It's almost deliberately torturous. And after all of that, you still have a 1 out of 4 chance to win another special colour Vitz, which happened in my playthrough as well.
Well, at least it's not pink.
Unbalanced prize cars is another big issue with GT3 and is certainly not exclusive to the Vitz race, and that's how All Rhino ended up with his 4 Toyota Vitz. Seems like they overestimated how enthused people would be with this mundane economy car. Who could have seen that coming? Personally, I like to put my Pink Vitz on a set of raised Vesta strawberry wheels. It really completes the look if you ask me. Now, I know what you're all thinking. Can I get Pink Vitz in any other games? Well, sort of. In GT4, the Vitz race returns as a 5-race event, and your prize car, a special colour orange Vitz. The Vitz race is also in GT5, but gives you a Prius for winning in both A-Spec and B-Spec. It's not much better, but at least they learnt their lesson. So another specific car, specific colour meme, so I guess the origin is something similar to the Pink Vitz, right? Haha, no. I know it might upset some people, but the truth is that the Yellow Evo meme has very little to do with the Yellow Evo. It's all about the song, which is Mirage by Daiki Kasho. Kasho went on to compose many more songs for Gran Turismo, but as far as I can tell, this was actually the first song he composed to ever feature in the series. Albeit not the first to feature in a Polyphony digital game, because he did jointly compose a song for a Mega Boost, Polyphony's 3D mecha shooter. The reason I say this is the first of his songs in Gran Turismo is because it's the title track of GT2000. In case you didn't know, GT2000 was the working title of GT3, originally shown off in late 1999. The estimated release date of December 2000 came and went, and so did the name GT2000, since it wouldn't really make sense anymore. On a side note, I like to imagine what would have happened if they actually released GT2000. Would every other GT game after that have the year in the title as well, or would they go back to numbers? Would that make GT4 GT3 and so on? Weird to think about. Anyway, GT2000 did still exist as a limited time demo, and the intro to this demo is where the meme comes from. In terms of who popularized the meme, that honor of course goes to BK4, who I'm sure many of you will already be aware of for his posting prowess, and I'm sure this won't be the last time I mention him. In his original video, he effectively uses the song as a jump scare, which makes sense given that listening to that initial part of the song is like being punched in the face. Mirage also appeared in the full release of GT3 alongside 4 more songs by Kasho. Although I like these songs and have good memories of them, I'd be lying if I said I could tell my strike breakers apart from my skyscrapers. Other than Mirage, they all seem to occupy the same space in my brain. They may be a bit too generic sounding, but at least fit the theme of GT3 very well. But the game of GT2000 is a weird one. It looks like GT3, but everything's just a little bit off. Maybe GT 2.5. In my mind, it really does feel like a completely different game rather than just an early version of GT3. What I haven't mentioned yet is the track. Seattle Circuit, the only circuit available in the demo. Does it add to the meme? Maybe. It's got those jumps and the whole sunset aesthetic, so it's possible, but like I say, I think the Yellow Evo itself is just incidental. Personally, I prefer to live in the timeline where it's the blue Skyline meme, or the red RX-7 meme. Yeah, it's all about the song, and it's my view that it would have become a meme either way. With my videos, I like to rationalize things, think them through to their logical conclusions. With memes like these, you can try, as I have done, but it's not really gonna work. Because frankly, if you just switch your brain off, stuff like this makes a lot more sense. In a return to the just look at it meme format, we have the Toyota Pod. Although that's not the full story. Yes, the pod is funky looking, but it's more interesting than that. It has emotions. Well, an emotion system. It has 4 emotions, which are represented by LED lights on its body, which change in 4 colours. Cyan for neutral, yellow for happy, blue for sad, and red for angry. The emotions change based on the player's driving, such as overtaking cars, crashing, etc. It also has a rear antenna that acts like a tail, moving around based on its emotion, and it plays a sound tone for every emotion change. Yeah, it's not hard to see why this one's a meme. A car with emotions. Who asked for this? I'd argue one of the best things about cars is that they don't have emotions, apart from the ones that we put onto them. They don't go around saying, I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm angry, and that's probably for the best. But at least that gives the pod its meme potential. So the pod only featured in one game, Gran Turismo Concept, a short game released in Asia and Europe based on GT3 that focused on showcasing then new concept cars. And not only that, but the pod is so far the only car in the series to have its own dedicated circuit, unless you include the Lunar Rover from GT6, which I don't. Pod Race, as it's known, is a very short circuit built using part of the front straight and pit lane of Special Stage Route 5, and only the Toyota pod can be driven on it. Interestingly though, Special Stage Route 5 itself is not playable in Gran Turismo Concept, only Pod Race. It's a fairly simple track made of 2 hairpin turns, but does feature curbs to make chicanes and even has a big ramp. However, the gimmick of Pod Race is that just before the ramp, you have to come to a full stop and put your handbrake on before you're allowed to continue. If you don't and take the ramp at full speed, you end up disqualified. Classic polyphony not letting us have fun. Pretty much everything about the pod and Pod Race is weird, and I guess that's kind of the point. When you look at it like that, it was inevitable that this would end up as a meme despite its relative obscurity. Anyway, all that's left to say is...
Now this is pod racing!
The meme of the GT40 road car goes by a few names. Some call it the Cheat T40, or He's There / He's Not There. But what am I talking about? So this one is another event-specific meme, but the twist is that rather than the meme being the car the player is driving, it's one of the opponents instead. This one takes us back to GT2, and specifically the historic Car Cup race at Rome Circuit. So with GT2, a lot of events had horsepower limits for which cars can be used. For this race in particular, it's 295 brake horsepower. The GT40 has 305. Yeah, so 10 bhp over. The crazy thing is though that the GT40 is by far not the worst cheater in the game. In fact, within the same event, there is an even bigger cheater. At the Grindelwald race, you'll sometimes come up against the Corvette Stingray, which is a whopping 39 brake horsepower over the limit. So why is the GT40 a meme but the Corvette isn't? Well, simply that even with its massive power advantage, the Corvette still isn't very fast and can easily be outclassed by less powerful cars at a technical track like Grindelwald. The GT40 on the other hand is pretty much just the race car with a bit less power and no livery. And it's not just about power, it has bags of cornering ability thanks to its downforce and is miles faster than any other AI opponents in the same race. Again, BK4 popularised the cheating GT40 as a meme through his videos titled He's There and He's Not There, which are fairly self-explanatory. If you want to know more about the cheating AI cars in GT2, I'd recommend Matt J155's video on the topic, because if you think the GT40's bad, you ain't seen shit. How about the AI breaking what's physically possible with tuning to have more powerful versions of the same cars than players are ever allowed to? Really. The good news is that the GT40 is not a guaranteed opponent in the race, so if you get it, just exit out and re-enter until it's not there. Simple. Makes you wonder why this is even a meme in the first place. Who knew the GT community was such a bunch of drama queens? I was reluctant to call this one a meme, but I think it deserves it. The Suzuki Escudo Pikes Peak is iconic to Gran Turismo, and very few people would even know about it if it weren't for these games. Debuting once again in GT2, it is featured in 6 more games after that, most recently being added to Gran Turismo 7 in an update. In GT2, it featured alongside its predecessor, the Suzuki Cultus Pikes Peak, and the track it was designed for, the Pikes Peak International Hill Climb. The car itself is a beast, almost 1000 horsepower, insane aero, and a mid-engine 4-wheel drive layout means that it boasts ridiculous performance both on dirt and tarmac. In GT2, it was known as the all-round fastest car in the game, and although it was never quite as dominant in the later titles, it was still in the top tier of performance alongside many Le Mans prototypes. That's all well and good, but how can it be considered a meme? Well, if we go back to GT3, the Escudo was the subject of maybe the most infamous glitch in Gran Turismo history, known as either the 2,147,483,647 speedometer glitch, or simply just the wheelie glitch. This was a bug in which the car could be set up in a way to cause it to wheelie and confuse the physics engine into thinking the car was continuously falling, and thus allowing it to accelerate infinitely. Combining this with an out-of-bounds glitch, most notably at Seattle Circuit, meant that the car could reach the aforementioned speed before the game would crash. It's worth noting the glitch can also be performed with a Toyota GT1 race car, but it's most commonly associated with the Escudo. Although it's mostly just for fun, it does have its uses, such as in races at the test course where it can achieve some incredible speed and leave all the opponents in the dust. Adding to its mythical status was that when the car was added to GT7 in June 2022, it came with another glitch. This one was far more frustrating, because it prevented the car from appearing in the Legend Cars dealership beyond its initial run. So if you didn't get it back in June or July 2022, you were screwed. The good news is that they did fix this, a mere 9 months later, but the bug still exists for another car in the same update, the 1932 Ford Roadster. Great work, Polyphony. So even though the Escudo was designed for the dirt, its biggest legacy in Gran Turismo will always be on the asphalt. Here's a fun fact about the real car. Despite the version featured in Gran Turismo always being the 1998 model, with the version from GT2 having some details taken from the 1996 car, it only won Pikes Peak on 2 occasions, its debut in 1995 and its final event in 2006. Also, the version of Pikes Peak which featured in GT2 was a much shortened version of the real-life course. So we've got the car, but what about the track that goes with it? Over the years, there have been numerous rumours about the Pikes Peak hill climb returning to Gran Turismo. In 2010, just after the release of GT5, the official Red Bull blog even stated that it was already in the game. Despite this clearly not being true, bizarrely in 2019, it was discovered that the original Pikes Peak from GT2 was hidden within GT5. Of course, it was still using PS1 textures, and a lot of them were missing, but this shows that it's possible Pikes Peak was planned to be included in GT5 at some point. Also, in 2017, it was confirmed that Gran Turismo has the exclusive rights to use Pikes Peak. This came after its inclusion in 2015's Dirt Rally, and then sudden disappearance from that series. It has to be assumed that this license is still in place due to Pikes Peak not featuring in any other game since, and despite Gran Turismo even sponsoring the real-life Pikes Peak hill climb, it is still yet to return even 6 years after this revelation. Exclusivity deals in racing games are never good. Gran Turismo knows this very well, but to not even use the content you have sole access to is downright disgraceful. GT7 also now features the Volkswagen IDR, the current overall record holder at Pikes Peak, but until the track itself is added, these cars don't have much to do. In the case of the Escudo, it's now a fallen giant that doesn't have any real purpose within GT's modern group system. Maybe it can return to glory one day, but for now we can only hope. Let's take a trip back to GT4's license centre. We've talked about coffee breaks, but what about the tests themselves? The most infamous of these have to be the one-lap guide runs, a type of license test which has never returned to the series. There's quite a few of these, but the one that most people will point to as the definitive reason why the Skyline pace car is a meme is the final one, IA15. Just like Mission 34, it's a full lap of the Nordschleife in a Mercedes, the 190e Evo 2. These guide runs are just like regular time trials, except you have the pace car running in front of you for the whole lap. Don't hit the pace car, don't overtake the pace car. Simple enough in theory, but in practice it's a different story. The key is to match yourself with the pace car, braking roughly when it does and using the same racing lines. The difficulty is that you have to remember all of this for a 9-minute lap, and if you misjudge even one braking zone, which is very easy to do given how inconsistent the AI can sometimes be, then it's back to the start. But at the same time, you can't back off too much because you still need to beat the target time. There is a reason why a lot of people consider this to be the hardest test in GT4, harder than anything in the Super license. Many GT4 players have even reported having nightmares featuring the pace car. I haven't fact-checked that, but it's probably true. Did you know the pace car actually debuted in GT Concept, where it had a similar purpose in the course license mode? Although in this case it was optional, and colliding with it or overtaking it didn't result in a failure. Coincidentally, completing all of the course licenses is how you unlock the pod race. In real life, a Nissan Skyline has been used as an actual pace car, albeit the previous generation R33, which was famously the official pace car at the 1997 24 Hours of Le Mans. Also, the Skyline which isn't a Skyline, the 300 GT, was the official safety car at Sportsland Sugo in Japan for a few years in the early 2000s. Like I said, these guide run tests never returned to Gran Turismo, but the Skyline pace car did, although at this point it didn't really serve much purpose and was just kind of carried forward from GT4 into 5 and 6. However, in GT Sport, many pace cars were included, even an R35 GT-R to replace the Skyline. But outside of a few pre-release trailers where they were used to lead the field for rolling starts, these pace cars once again didn't have any functional use in the game. Now in GT7 it's the same situation, so although the pace cars now just exist as a novelty, we all remember that one time when it was so much more important. For better or for worse. Now this one is a little bit more obscure than the rest, but an excellent meme nonetheless. Another specific car in a specific colour, and another completely different origin. This Impreza, which is a fictional Impreza rally car, rather than the fully licensed real-life version, only appeared in GT1 and 2, and alongside the traditional Impreza Blue, also had a black variant. Some may look at it and consider it a cursed car due to this unlikely livery combination, but that's not what this is about. You see, the Black Impreza became well known due to a video released last year by Matt J155, the Gran Turismo Iceberg. Definitely check it out if you haven't already, because it's excellent and there's tons of cool information in there. The Black Impreza is actually the last entry in his Iceberg and centers around some official footage of the original Gran Turismo in which the car can be seen at Trial Mountain. Whoever was tasked with driving it though was clearly not very good at the game. The car can be seen spinning out, crashing into almost everything, and at one point it cuts to the car just flying through the air for seemingly no reason. It's amazing. In his video, Matt mentions that this footage comes from the Gran Turismo 3 Le Mans press kit, which is true, and he's made a video showing that off as well, but its origins go back a bit further than that. This video was actually a pre-release trailer made to advertise GT1 back in 1997, and beyond just the Impreza, honestly the whole video is a complete mess. Made using mostly in-game replays, it features pretty consistently terrible driving, and even the replay HUD awkwardly appearing on screen for a few scenes. It also gives us the incredible tagline of over 10 tracks, GT1 had 11 tracks, by the way, and incredible detail just before the camera clips through the Castrol Supra. Truly a work of art. But despite all of that, it's still the Black Impreza that really steals the show. It's insane how they thought that a game which was billed as the real driving simulator should be advertised like this, showing off literally the most unrealistic things about it. We can say it's a bad advertisement, but the fact that I'm sitting here 26 years later still talking about it means that maybe they were actually onto something. The final car I want to talk about in this video is from the future. The future being last year, and last year according to our standards in 2004. Yeah, I get wanting to do a prediction of what car design may look like in the future, but making your prediction for only 18 years on is kind of setting yourself up for failure if you ask me. Even in the 1950s they gave themselves a good half a century, so that when they were inevitably wrong, it was at least understandable. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is that the Nike One is pretty well loved in the GT community, but how can this be the case when so many other concept cars of the same ilk, such as Vision GT cars, are sometimes forgotten almost instantly, despite being far more outlandish? Well, I'm going to discuss the Vision GT side of that argument another time, but as for the Nike, a big part of it is that it was the first concept car of this type, predating the countless Vision GTs and even stuff like the GT by Citroën. A car being designed collaboratively with a company especially for these games was a pretty radical idea back in 2004, especially when said company normally deals in clothing. And I have to say that the design, penned by Phil Frank, has a type of appeal which other similar concept cars, for example the Toyota Motor Triathlon race car, a car many of you will have forgotten entirely until I just mentioned it, simply don't have. Although it's rooted to two separate periods in time through its creation and its name, it feels somewhat timeless. Naturally, only being being included in one game, GT4, has only helped add to that mystique. Even still, I'm sure I wasn't alone in playing GT4, unlocking this car, trying it out and then thinking that was cool and then never touching it again. So the question is, how did it manage to stay so relevant in GT meme culture? Well, in my view, it's almost entirely down to the name, Nike One 2022. The amount of times in the past few years that I saw comments like, can't wait to drive this IRL in 3 years, 2 years, 1 year, and now negative 1 year, I guess, is immeasurable, really. And maybe that was their goal, by setting the hypothetical release date in the not too distant future, just far enough to give it a futurism flavoured intrigue, but not too far so that it still maintains relevancy. Incredibly smart if that's actually true. Many Vision GTs since then have done the same thing, but there's no chance they'll be anywhere near as well remembered as the Nike. It was the original and there is no replacement. Even despite Vision GT cars being mostly disregarded, there have been countless cries for the Nike to return in GT7, and looking at the full picture, it's easy to understand why. What I wonder now is, where do we go from here? 2022 has come and gone, and obviously the Nike One isn't in production, but it hasn't returned to Gran Turismo either, and there's a good chance that it never will. If so, will the Nike continue to be relevant like it has for the past few years, or just fade into the background like so many other concept cars throughout the history of Gran Turismo? Well, we'll just have to wait and see. Meme cars in Gran Turismo. They come in all shapes and sizes, from JDM Legends to V12 limos, classic sports cars and quirky concepts. It seems nothing is off limits. These are the ones I really wanted to talk about and think are the most interesting, and hopefully I've been able to add a bit of context and help you understand these memes better. If there are any other meme cars which I didn't mention here, there's sure to be a few, then please let me know in the comments. But don't start your comment with "you forgot," because if you do that, I'll come down there and I'll personally kick you up the ass. So please don't. But anyway, memes are inside jokes, and as we all know, having to explain a joke always makes it less funny. So, am I justified in making this video? If you play through a Gran Turismo game, there will always be certain cars that stick in your mind. Maybe it's a car that you used quite often, or one you were given to use for a specific event, or even a car you came up against as an opponent that was particularly memorable for some reason. It's not surprising, given the sheer number of cars to have featured in this series, that a few will become legendary. But quite often, these are for reasons which the developers hadn't really anticipated. This video is a follow-up to my Gran Turismo meme cars video, which I'd recommend watching if you haven't already, in which I explain the origins of some of the most well-known and interesting cars that have become memes in the GT community. But the truth is that there are many cars throughout the history of Gran Turismo that aren't necessarily memes, but are memorable for very specific reasons. The thing about Gran Turismo games, particularly the older titles, is that any given person's experience of playing through the game can be drastically different from the next person's. Now, there will be shared experiences, but depending on which game you play, which events you do, and of course which cars you decide to drive, you're very unlikely to experience everything the game has to offer in a single playthrough. So what I'm going to do is take you through a generalized experience of playing through a Gran Turismo game, and some of the interesting and just downright bizarre situations you may come across. And in most cases, the cars are key to that situation. Ready? Okay, these are Gran Turismo's most infamous cars. Let's dive in. So, what's the first thing you're likely to do after being plopped down into GT World? Probably use the limited amount of credits you've been given to buy your first car, a defining moment in any GT playthrough. Unless you're playing GT2 or GT4, you're most likely going to have to settle for a bit of a shitbox. But it's your shitbox that you chose, and that's what's important. And it's a big deal which car you choose, because that will define a lot about your early playthrough, such as which events you can race in. Gran Turismo 6 has the most cars of any of these games, almost 1,300 by the end of its life cycle. So you might expect that the 30,000 credits you've been given, a very generous amount by GT standards, could open up many opportunities in terms of a starter car. And that would be true, if you weren't forced to spend most of that on a Honda Fit RS. So taking away all player choice from the situation. Really. You know, forget Mount Chiliad or whatever. To me, this is the biggest mystery in video game history. Hey, that rhymed. How did they think this was a good idea? Maybe they were worried that people would get overwhelmed by the options and pick a really bad car by accident. But 30 grand is a lot of money, and GT6 is piss easy, so that shouldn't be a problem. Also, they could have just recommended the fit, they didn't have to force it on you, or just reduce your starting credits so you had much fewer options. Whichever way you look at it, it's just a really odd decision, and more than anything, tallies with the fact that by GT6, it seemed like Polyphony didn't really care about the single player experience anymore. But speaking of bad starter cars, how about the Mazda Demio? The first gen Mazda Demio, known as the Mazda 2 outside of Japan, is legendary in Gran Turismo, and that's for a few reasons. One is that it features in the first license test of the original Gran Turismo, so for many people, this was the very first car they ever drove in these games. Another is that in almost every GT game, it's always an option as a starter car. But the truth is that you'd only really pick it if you didn't know that much about cars. There were always much better options, which were often even cheaper than the Demio. But don't think you can escape the Demio that easily, because again in GT1, it was actually given out as a prize car for the first event in the game, the Sunday Cup. And not just a regular Demio, but a tuned Mazda Speed Demio A-Spec. Despite that, it's still quite slow, but what's funny is that in 2022, a real-life racing series in the UK, called the MSVT Turismo X, actually offered a real first-gen Demio as a prize car, in homage to Gran Turismo. Not an A-Spec sadly, just a basic Demio, which was maybe the reason why it struggled to attract competitors, and the series was scrapped for 2023. Anyway, within Gran Turismo, the Demio A-Spec's actual claim to fame is that when upgraded, it has a truly bizarre engine sound. I don't know what you expect me to add to that, it kind of just speaks for itself. Literally. After you've bought your first car, you might be tempted to jump straight into the racing, but not so fast. In most GT games, there will be a handful of events you can do right off the bat, but you're still going to need to get your licenses if you want to progress further. The license tests are an iconic part of Gran Turismo. Without them, it would feel like something is missing, but that's not to say they're all good. Part of the experience of doing license tests is failing at license tests, usually in quite frustrating ways. Everyone has that memory of being stuck on a specific test in one of these games. For me personally, it was test International B7 from GT3, a slalom at complex string in a roof RGT with the assists forced off. No matter how hard I tried as a kid, I could never pass it. The same was true for R6 in the rally license. Of course, we could talk about particularly difficult tests forever. There was no shortage of them in the older Gran Turismos, but there's one car that I want to single out as having two of the hardest license tests in Gran Turismo history from two separate games. And amazingly, they weren't even from late game licenses, nor were they even the final tests within their respective license. That car in question is the Chevrolet Camaro Z28 Coupe, otherwise known as the PTSD Camaro. You'll see why in a second. Firstly, with GT2, we have test IC3, in which you have to navigate two 90-degree left-handers. Not too difficult, but then IC4 has us doing the same thing, but with walls on either side, meaning you can't carry as much speed, and it's much more difficult to judge as they're now blind corners. It is brutally difficult, given the clear times are the same as IC3, requiring almost perfect inputs and timing if you're trying to get gold. Funnily enough, it's not even the hardest test in GT2's International C license. That credit goes to IC9, in which the demo replay showing you how to do it doesn't even manage to get gold itself. Now, that does overshadow IC4, but there's one key difference. IC9 can be cheesed very easily. Hey, someone should tell Polyphony and they might be able to finally gold it themselves. Moving on to GT3, the Camaro returns in license A7 at Seattle. Again, the focus is 90-degree corners, but just one this time, and once again it is ball-crushingly difficult to get gold. I must admit that I find 90-degree corners at street circuits fairly natural, so after a few attempts I could get the line down and gold it with not too much difficulty. But the margin for error in this test is very small. a lot smaller than what you'll find in other tests, including most of the later licenses. If you use reverse shifting, which is the act of just tapping the reverse button at high revs to change upper gear whilst not losing much acceleration, that can also make this test a bit easier. Without reverse shifting, the world record for this test is just over a tenth below the goal time. That should tell you just how fine the margins are. With many other tests, it's more about the challenge of putting together a clean and fast run rather than being inch perfect. To me, that's what sets these Camaro tests apart from the rest. So with that said, on the other side of the spectrum we have something like S5 from GT6, in which you have a 1-lap time trial at Ascari Race Resort in a Bugatti Veyron. In contrast, the fastest time I could find for this one is more than 10 seconds below the goal time. Of course it is a much longer test, but even in percentage terms that is a massive difference. So that might lead you to believe that this test is quite easy. And from numbers alone you could make that argument, but that still doesn't explain why so many people struggled with this test. I remember seeing the comments at the time, just how frustrated people were getting because they couldn't get gold. Was it just a case of them not knowing or forgetting how hard the test used to be? Maybe, but I think there's another reason. So we have this high power hypercar at this really technical track. From a lot of these comments, it seemed like people felt they couldn't push the car anymore, they had reached the ceiling of what was possible. The obvious issue was understeer. You can't really drive past understeer or use it in a beneficial way like you can with oversteer. It can just feel like a limitation. But if you watch these fast times, they're very forceful with how they push the car into the corners, in some places four-wheel drifting with smoke pouring off the tyres. It's not exactly conventional, and to me, this is where the skill gap comes from. You have to drive the car in a very unnatural way to get the best times from it. Given the odd car and track combination, I guess that's not too surprising. So rather than the time requirement being the challenge, the real challenge is the car itself. I remember the first few times I tried it and could barely keep the thing on the track. It just wouldn't turn. But after a few laps I understood and beat the time easily. They often say that you don't want to fight the car, you should let it move naturally to get the most speed out of it. In this particular situation, that is completely wrong. You have to fight the car into doing what you want it to, and to me, this is why there was such a discrepancy in the times between the people who couldn't do it but felt like they were driving on the limit, and those who could clear it with seconds in hand. As you can see, a huge difference from the Camaro tests, but they cause PTSD all the same. So now you've got your licenses, it's finally time to race. And that means you'll encounter the AI opponents. Let's be honest, the AI in Gran Turismo has never been great. In more recent games, it's about how slow and unaware they normally are, and in the older games, they're a lot more exciting and raceable, with the caveat that they're completely out of control most of the time. GT2 in particular showcases this quite well. Places like the Corkscrew at Laguna Seca, Turn 1 at Grand Valley, and Turn 4 at Seattle always screw them up. And at pretty much every other circuit, there will be at least one place where they routinely drive off the track or straight into a wall. It's not pretty, but what did you expect in those early days? The series would then move on to the PS2 hardware, starting with GT3, and with this came an upgrade to the AI, something which Polyphony was certainly keen to hype up. Ooh, emotion physics. What the hell does that mean? But even if the improvements over GT2 were clear in this area, there were a few things which didn't change. Despite the carnage in GT2, whenever I think of AI fails in Gran Turismo, I think of the Shelby Cobra in GT3. And specifically the Shelby Cobra at Laguna Seca. Given that it's an American car and an American track, you tend to find it there very often. And it's not just the Corkscrew, which can catch out other cars, but also Turn 1 and the final corner prove to be big obstacles for it. It is a very fast car, especially in the Beginner League Stars and Stripes event, but due to its tendency to self-immolate, it's rarely ever your main challenger. The mix of big power, low weight, and 1960s engineering all result in the spectacular downfall of GT3's advanced AI. Emotion physics can't save you now, bitch. But another side effect of that is how it chews through rubber in events that feature tyre wear. In the Seattle Circuit 100 miles endurance race, where it can again come up as an opponent, it can manage a total of, get this, 2 laps before it has to pit for tyres. 2 laps. Why even bother racing at that point? Just leave the car in the pits and take a ride on the Space Needle or something. What a waste of time. Moving on to GT4, the AI were again a little bit more refined, but still capable of doing the big stupid. Even still, the Cobra was much improved as an opponent, including at Laguna Seca, and was even quite formidable in a few events. Although that wasn't just down to the driving. In a few events for specifically classic cars, the Cobra is easily the class of the field. For instance, the World Classic Car Series, where along with the tuned Buick Special, it can lap 10 to 20 seconds faster than the other opponents. And the same is true in the 1000 miles events. Whether or not the Cobra shows up as an opponent massively changes the difficulty of the event, which has happened before in Gran Turismo, but the Cobra in GT4 is probably the most extreme example of this I can remember, outside of something we'll talk about later. Its appearance in GT4 couldn't be much more different to GT3, with the exception of its tyre life, which is still terrible. What's interesting is that the Cobra in these classic car events isn't the Shelby Cobra, but rather the AC Cobra. It's pretty much the same car, but weighs quite a lot more than the Shelby, and apparently that makes it far easier to drive. To me, the Cobra perfectly sums up the dichotomy of AI opponents in Gran Turismo. Stupid and stupidly fast. Unacceptable and unbeatable. As you continue onwards in your Gran Turismo journey, you will come across one-make races, race events for specific makes and models of cars. These were first introduced in GT2 and have been a staple of the series ever since. In their first iteration, they were quite basic, just a single race at a randomly chosen track with a small payout, but as the series moved forward, they would begin to increase in scope. In GT3, they became fully fledged multiple race events integrated into the main career mode. These even included full championships, with the Vitz Race Championships being by far the most infamous. Check out my Meme Cars video for a full breakdown of why that is. But for me, when I picture one-make races in Gran Turismo, I think of GT4, and part of that is down to sheer numbers. Let me put it this way. In GT4, there are more one-make events than there are events in the Beginner League, Professional League, Extreme League, American events, European events, or Japanese events combined. And unlike GT2, these aren't short one-race events. Most of them are multiple races, sometimes even 5-race championships taking almost an entire hour to complete. And the events themselves can feel like a lottery. The ones that have become the most well known are for their difficulty. The 206 Cup for the Peugeot 206 is one such example. Whilst most one-make events in GT4 have stock or lightly tuned opponent cars, the 206 Cup has heavily tuned opponents, meaning that a Stage 3 turbo kit and racing tyres are pretty much a must just to keep up. I feel bad for people who got a 206 in their playthrough and decided to give this event a go, only to be beaten to a bloody pulp. And unless they want to spend several times what the car is even worth in upgrades, they've got no chance. The only upside is that you can cheese the events by using the 206 World Rally car, but given the cost, you'll have to wait until much later in your playthrough. But probably the most infamous event in GT4 is the Opel Speedster Trophy. Basically, take what I said about the 206 Cup and jack it up another level. The opponent cars are not just heavily tuned, but impossibly tuned. They are more powerful than what you as a player can achieve, meaning that you will almost always get maximum A-spec points for winning it. This sort of artificial difficulty was quite common in, say, GT2, but in GT4 it really is an anomaly. You know it's tough when the Gran Turismo wiki has not only a strategy section for this event, but a strategy section with this much information. One positive is that the AI's fallibility does sometimes come through, which makes it a bit easier, but it's still anything but a walkover. Now, the question that has to be asked is why were these events in particular made so difficult? I think this is most likely down to the prize cars you receive from them. The 206 Cup grants you the 205 T16 Group B rally car, and for the Speedster Trophy, the Calibra DTM car. Pretty awesome prizes that almost make them worth the trouble. And that's the point. It seems like they wanted to give out these prize cars, but realized that if these events were a normal level of difficulty, they would be completely broken and an easy ticket into some really fast cars. Of course, they could have just given worse prizes for them, but jacking up the difficulty was the solution they went with instead. However, not every event follows that same line of thinking. The Stars of Pleiades is a Subaru one-make event where you come up against some lightly tuned Imprezas and Legacies, and as well as a healthy championship bonus, you can win the Impreza Super Touring car, which is fast and versatile given that in GT3 and 4 you can even drive it on dirt and snow. In this case, the prize car is not at all proportional with the difficulty of the event, which is fairly easy. Albeit you do need an IB license to enter, this still means that the event can be done fairly early into a playthrough. All of this is to say that when it comes to Gran Turismo, despite the name, not all one-make races are created equal. Now, depending on the game, there will come a time when you're a bit strapped for cash. Maybe you're saving up for a particular car or whatever, but the bottom line is that you need money fast. Money-making methods are always popular in these games, be it GT7 with the 3 best paying races added post-launch specifically for grinding, to GT6 and the Red Bull X2014 Standard Championship again added in an update. People are always on the lookout for replayable events which earn the most money. And these money-making methods have existed for pretty much as long as Gran Turismo itself. If we go back to GT2, we can find a pretty ridiculous one. In GT2, you have the ability to win multiple prize cars by simply replaying a race, and this can be very easily exploited. One very well-known method is to win the 5th race of the 80 Sports Car Cup at Tahiti Road. This can be done using even a starter car, such as the Skyline R32 GTST with minor upgrades. You will need an International B license to compete, but the race itself isn't too hard and only takes about 4 minutes to finish. And yet winning this single race gives you the Nissan R30 Skyline Silhouette race car. And if you want to, you can repeat it, selling each Skyline for 125,000 credits a pop. But you could take it even further. By taking the R30 Silhouette to the 3rd race of the Gran Turismo All-Stars event at Red Rock Valley, which is again not too difficult and only takes about 6 minutes, you can win the TVR Speed 12, which can be sold for $500,000. In addition to the 50,000 credits you get for winning the race, that is 550,000 credits in only 6 minutes, which equates to over 91,000 credits per minute, or almost 5.5 million credits per hour. I don't think there will ever be a money-making method as busted as this ever again. And with GT3, they understandably toned it down massively. You now need to win all the races in a single race event, which is at least 3, or a full championship to receive a prize car, with the exception of much longer endurance races. And once you've won a prize car, you can't win it again, except for endurance races or championships, which give you a random roulette of 4 possible cars. The championships can be save scum to get the car you want, but that is time consuming. But then we come to GT4. With GT4, they reversed their decision, and now you have the ability to clear your completion from events to complete them again and earn another prize car. And this can be done continuously, just like GT2. And again, this was quickly exploited. The most famous method is to complete the Capri Rally Easy, which takes roughly 10 minutes, maybe less if you use a faster car, and can be done fairly easily, given you'll be up against Lancia Deltas and Toyota Celicas. The prize is a Toyota RSC Rally Raid car, which can be sold for 265,000 credits. Plus the 10,000 you get for winning the 2 races means you can earn roughly 27,500 credits per minute, or 1.65 million per hour. This method is again so useful because it can be done so early into your playthrough. You only need a National A license, and the opponents, as I've said, are nothing special. You might even be able to beat them in your starter car. And if you're struggling, you can take advantage of the layout of Costa di Amalfi and just wall ride the corners. There are far better money-making methods in this game, most taking advantage of B-Spec, where the car is driven for you and you can increase the speed by ×3. But most of these can only be done later in the game with the required cars. The Capri Rally can be done almost immediately, so it's not surprising that it became so legendary. From GT5 onwards, they again removed the ability to repeatedly win prize cars for good, so it's unlikely that this sort of thing will ever happen again. Even still, we can look back at these methods fondly, in particular the Toyota RSC, which became a legend in the Gran Turismo community without even turning a wheel. Well, by this point in your playthrough, you're probably starting to get into some of the tougher events, such as ones featuring race cars. Gran Turismo has featured many real-world race cars, but also plenty of fictional ones as well. This is a remnant of the early days of Gran Turismo, when they couldn't get the licenses to use many of these real race cars, so they just made their own. A lot of the time based on real-life race cars, but sometimes their own original creations. and this practice has been carried through to current day. You'll find plenty of fictional racing variants in Groups 3 and 4 for instance. Groups 3 and 4 are equivalents to the real-life GT3 and GT4 regulations, and as such, the fictional cars that have been made for them will fit in line with these also. Well, almost. Whilst most of these made-up racing cars are designed using a real car as a basis, what if some of them weren't? What if they were designed from some radical concept cars instead? Enter Vision GT. I've covered Vision GT in depth in its own video, talking about its origins, the concepts it's produced, and the overall reception. But what I want to talk about now are the race cars, particularly the ones that have been adapted to Group 3 regulations. On one end of the scale, we have something like the Toyota FT1 Vision GT. From conception, it's basically just a race car version of the FT1 concept car, so it was slotted into Group 3 very easily by just altering its performance without having to fundamentally change the design of the car. But the same cannot be said for something like the original Peugeot Vision GT car. It's an almost 900 horsepower, four-wheel drive, futuristic hypercar, which they've tried to turn into a GT3 racer. It reminds me of the Veyron, which they forced into Group 4 with a detuned engine, but when fully upgraded, it still makes less power than the road car. Wonderful. Points for effort, but this was always going to be a bit weird. It kind of completely defeats the point of the original car to homogenize it to a common rule set like GT3, given that its specs are now completely different, but okay. I just think it's amazing that you can look at the original car without any side windows and think, huh, that's funny, but in the context of a modern day GT3 race car, it is downright hilarious. In classic Vision GT fashion, it still has no interior, meaning that it is the only Group 3 car in GT7 to not have one. But a Vision GT car that does have an interior is the Volkswagen GTI Vision GT, which again was made into a Group 3 race car. The GTI comes in two forms, the Supersport and the Roadster, so logically they based the race car on the one that doesn't have a roof. Yep, if the Peugeot was downright hilarious, I don't even know what they were thinking here. Much like the Peugeot, the original Vision GT car it's based on is four-wheel drive, but to fit with Group 3 regulations, it's been converted to rear-wheel drive. It's also apparently now mid-engined. That's despite the original car being front-engined, as shown in official illustrations, and the car still retaining the vents on the hood, which are now presumably just for show. It just seems like they kinda winged it on this one. Why does it need to be mid-engined? Why couldn't it just be FR? Who knows? So many things about this car are just weird. But did you know that there was a Group B rally car version of the Supersport originally planned to be in GT Sport? Despite that actually making sense, they scrapped it. Yet the Group 3 Roadster abomination was deemed worthy, somehow. But maybe these cars were made out of necessity, as manufacturers need to have a car in both Group 3 and 4 to take part in the Manufacturers' Cup. Well, no. Peugeot also had an RCZ-based Group 3 race car, which looks awesome and is actually designed like a midship car, might I add. And for Volkswagen, there was a car based on the Beetle. It's not much better, but at least it's got a f***ing roof. So, these cars look completely out of place, contradict their original designs, and worst of all, don't even have a reason to exist. That is the trifecta of awful. The Suzuki Vision GT was later made into a Group 3 race car as well, and again, they didn't put a roof on it. At least this one has an actual purpose. Oh well, I still think they're kinda cool in a weird way, but if Gran Turismo really wants to be taken seriously as the real driving simulator, they need to be trying a little harder than this. So, with their fictional cars, Gran Turismo can do whatever they want with them. They don't exist, so they can just fudge the numbers. But with real cars, they can't get away with that. But that doesn't stop them from trying. Many cars throughout the history of Gran Turismo have had incorrect specs. GT2 is probably the worst offender of this, where cars would even show a certain horsepower in the dealership, and then when you bought it, the power would somehow change. And in some cases, both figures would still be wrong. A common example were the JGTC race cars in GT2. This was back in the days when GT300 and GT500 actually meant something, yet most GT300s had roughly 400 to 450 horsepower, and the GT500s between 600 to 700 horsepower. Ironically, that's not far off what these classes of cars make in current day Super GT. Regardless, given that the numbers were exaggerated for so many cars, it does seem like this was an intentional decision, but in some cases it was clearly accidental. The Lister Storm debuted in GT2 as well, and it had a racing modification to turn it into the Lister Storm V12 race car. This was all well and good, but in GT3 only the race car made the transition, with the road car being cut, still yet to return to the series. Despite this, the legacy of the Storm road car lived on in the race car. Not just because it's based on the road car, but because it incorrectly still has the same weight as the road car, 1,438 kilos. The real car, built to GT2 regulations, weighed only 1,100 kilos. What this means is that in GT3 it's noticeably slower than other similar race cars of that era, other GT2 cars, GTS cars, and GT500s. And amazingly, they never fixed this. It carried all the way through to its so far final inclusion in GT6. It went through its entire GT journey, spanning most of the mainline games, 300 kilos overweight. So the Lister Storm was not helped by having more weight than it did in reality. It made it slower and less useful. So surely having less weight or even more power would have the opposite effect, right? GT3 saw the debut of the Gillet Vertigo race car. This Belgian racer was built mainly for national GT racing, and in its debut game had 420 horsepower, despite the V6 Alfa Romeo unit it used never producing more than about 350. Like most race cars in GT3, it didn't have a model year attached to it, but internally was listed as the Vertigo 97, implying it was the 1997 model of the car. However, its 3.6 litre engine and livery with the dolphins on it indicates that it was actually the year 2000 model of the car. Given it's such an obscure car, some of these inconsistencies are understandable, and later in 2001, the real-life Vertigo ran by Belgian Racing would actually be sponsored by Gran Turismo 3. For Gran Turismo 4, the Vertigo would be replaced by the 2004 version of the car, so you'd think this would be their chance to correct these mistakes. Whilst the engine displacement had been increased to 3.8 litres, in GT4 the car now made 900 horsepower. Remember when I said about the GT6 starter car being the biggest video game mystery? Yeah, I changed my answer. Where did they get 900 horsepower from? No Vertigo, race car or road car has ever had anything close to 900 horsepower, not even when they started using a Ferrari-derived V8 engine. In real life, it still raced in the G2 class alongside 911 GT3 Cup cars. And this wasn't just a misinput. If you read the in-game description of the car, they genuinely thought it had 900 horsepower. But the power wasn't the only inaccuracy. For example, the name of the car. In 2002, the car was updated to the Vertigo Streff, in deference to former French Formula 1 driver Philippe Streff, which is not reflected in GT4. Also, the livery of the car in-game was never raced in real life. It seems to just be a very obscure show livery. I can't actually find any images of this myself, other than the dealership menu in GT4, which shows the real-life car in a very similar design. But more importantly, what impact did this massive increase in power have on the car in-game? Well, instead of being a moderately fast race car, somewhere between GT300 and GT500 performance as it was in real life, its extremely high power and very low weight meant that it was in the same performance window as the top-end Le Mans prototypes. And that meant you would end up seeing it in events such as Like the Wind and even the GT World Championship. And of course it would get completely destroyed. Just because it has similar specs to the LMPs doesn't mean it's anywhere near as fast, because it lacks downforce and the chassis just doesn't handle as well. It wasn't impossible to see the car finish last every single time you raced against it. The same would be true for later appearances in GT5 and 6, where in any event it would feature, such as Like the Wind again, it would always be right down the bottom of the results screen. It's sad because I really do like the Vertigo. If only they'd gotten the power more accurate or just kept the version that featured in GT3, it could have been a very solid, lightweight, mid-tier race car, but instead it just ended up as an overpriced joke. Inaccuracies with cars in Gran Turismo are a lot more common than you might think. Another very excessive example is the Volvo 240 GLT, which is a whopping 600 kilos overweight. The sheer number of mistakes, although some are intentional, is staggering when you look at them in one big list. Thankfully, it's not as common with the newer games after GT6, but again, it's just another quirk of old school Gran Turismo. Well, here we are. After everything, you're finally in the late game. And what does that mean in Gran Turismo terms? Endurance races. Typically, in the older Gran Turismos, endurance races are supposed to be done later into a playthrough, but in the first 3 games, the only restriction to enter them was having the necessary license. Now, typically, you would do each of the licenses gradually over the course of a playthrough, but if you wanted to, you could just do all of them immediately, if you were a complete psychopath. And what's clear is that Polyphony didn't really anticipate players doing this, as that's often the key to breaking the progression. For example, what I explained earlier with getting the Skyline silhouette in GT2, and even the Subaru One Make race from GT4. And endurance races can often play a part in this as well. Even though they tend to require later licenses, some of these races are actually for fairly basic cars. The best example is the Roadster Endurance from GT3, which despite needing the International A license, can be won with your starter car and a set of super hard tyres. And the race itself only takes just over an hour. But because these are classed as late game events, given the license and time investment needed, you can often get some ridiculous prize cars. With the Roadster Endurance, it's a 1 in 4 chance to win a Formula 1 car, like every other Endurance in GT3, which can easily wipe the floor with everything else. And thus, the game has been broken. But if you're looking for a more guaranteed way to break it, then GT2 has got you covered. Over there, you'll find the Trial Mountain 30 Laps Endurance. The opponents are primarily European cars with around 200 horsepower. Again, this could be won with your starter car plus a set of tyres. The only real challenge is the Lotus Elise, which has a chance of turning up, but other than that, it's a walkover. 50 minutes later, you should have a shiny new Denso Sard Supra boasting an unrealistic 700 horsepower, just about enough to beat any race in the game. As simple as that. Unless you're playing on the NTSCU version 1.0 of the game, because in that case, you may come up against something which you probably weren't expecting to see. The Vector M12 LM Edition. Its 680 horsepower far exceeds the 295 limit for the event. But why does this happen? Well, it wasn't intentional. Unlike many other cheating AI cars in GT2, this one was actually caused by a glitch. To put it simply, GT2 uses a global opponent list for events, and due to a car being moved around in this list late in development, it caused some cars to be moved up a spot and end up in events they were never intended to. The endurance races are the worst affected, with the M12 supposed to appear at the Millennium in Rome Endurance instead. This glitch was fixed for the later releases of the game, but here it causes some interesting effects. You might think that the Trial Mountain Endurance is now impossible if it turns up, but that's not the case. A few people have shown that it is still beatable within the 295 horsepower limit. MatchA155 has a great video demonstrating how the Vector can be beaten on tyre strategy, as well as a more in-depth explanation of the glitch itself. I'll link it in the description. The Vector at Trial Mountain is the most well known because it has real ramifications for players, since it is now by far the fastest opponent car that can appear in the race. But there are other examples. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the Citroen Xantia. The Xantia was the car that got pushed out by the M12 at Trial Mountain, where it was supposed to feature, and as such ended up in the Special Stage Route 5 all-night endurance instead. Its opponents are some of the fastest race cars in the game. And no matter how exclusive the Xantia may be, it's not going to go well for it. I'm sure there's some joke you could make about imposter syndrome and being in situations you shouldn't be able to, and how that parallels with getting these insane prize cars, but I'll leave that up to you to figure out. Also, in GT2, the Xantia has a 5-speed transmission, but when it reappeared in GT4 onwards, it has a 4-speed. This is because the V6 exclusive trim was never sold as a 5-speed, only a 4-speed auto. That is in fact the opposite of exclusive. Well, congratulations! By this point, you've pretty much beaten the game. But as you can see, it was far from simple. Throughout this journey, we've encountered some interesting situations, and the cars related to those situations. 15 of the cars which I mentioned in this video are what I consider to be some of the most infamous cars in Gran Turismo history. And that's for all manner of reasons. But what do you think? As I've said in those older GTs, it was all about the unique player experience and deciding what you want to do. You could play through all of these games and still never come across some of the cars I've talked about here. but you'll probably have your own experiences and there'll be cars that stick in your mind as particularly memorable. Whether it was a car that you used or was used against you, or any other reason that you might have an attachment, fondness, or even hatred towards it, that's kind of what Gran Turismo was all about. So please let me know about these in the comments, and if it was a shared experience or just something that's personal to you, I'd love to know either way. Just because these are virtual representations of machines doesn't mean that they're completely emotionless, because it's all about the experience you have with them and of course how the game is designed to allow you to have those experiences. That is what Gran Turismo means to me. Have a good one. So, you like cars, do ya? I feel like Gran Turismo as a series really puts a person's automotive passion to the test. Because you might like cars, but by playing through a Gran Turismo game, you will come to understand if you truly love cars. There's no doubt about it, the cars really are the heart of Gran Turismo. That's why I've already made a couple of videos covering some of the most interesting and noteworthy models to have featured in these games. But alongside the most meme-worthy cars, and the models that live in infamy amongst the GT community, I think we should really take a look at the cars that Gran Turismo itself thrust into the spotlight. Machines that were once doomed to obscurity, but thanks to these games, have in some cases become household names. These are the cars we'll be talking about, and not just about how they appeared in Gran Turismo, but also their often fascinating real-life stories as well. When talking about obscure and close to forgotten cars in this series, there's no way that we could avoid talking about Gran Turismo 2. Of course, the influx of international brands played a big part here. We could mention cars from the likes of Vector or Venturi, for example. But the car I want to highlight is actually still a Japanese domestic model. Tomi Kaira is a Japanese tuning company that appeared in the mid-80s, and became reasonably well known for their work on various Nissan and Subaru models in particular. A few of these tune models are even featured in GT2. But alongside those were a handful of original Tomi Kaira sports cars. Work first began on a sports car in 1992, and by 1995, the Tomi Kaira ZZ was shown publicly for the first time. It was a 180 horsepower, lightweight, mid-engine sports car built to rival the brand new Lotus Elise. Or at least that's what most people assume. It's often forgotten, but the ZZ was actually in development before the Elise, with both being unveiled at roughly the same time. Also, despite being produced solely for the Japanese market, the ZZ was designed and built in the UK, with many former Lotus engineers being involved. There was also an upgraded ZZS model, which boasted just shy of 200 horsepower. This version is the one that would go on to feature in GT2. And in GT2, the car is pretty solid. It weighs less than 700 kilos, so its 200 horsepower does feel like a bit more in practice. That said, if you still want to upgrade it further, it can top out at 279 horsepower. But with each of these videos I make about the cars of Gran Turismo, they always seem to come back to one topic: the cheating AI opponents in GT2. And interestingly, the Tomi Kaira ZZS is actually one of the worst cheaters that you can find. To demonstrate this, we should take a look at the Pure Sports Car Cup event where it sometimes appears. With the ZZS, this is not a case of it breaking the event restrictions, but rather breaking the tuning limits. As a reminder, the ZZS can only be tuned up to a maximum of 279 horsepower by the player. Yet in Race 1, the opponent ZZS will have 292 horsepower. In Race 2, it'll have 340 horsepower, and in Race 3, 487 horsepower. So yeah, some classic GT2 shenanigans. Anyway, why I chose the ZZS in particular over other similarly obscure cars from GT2, like the Tom's Angel T01 or the two other unique Tommy Kyra models, is because of what happened after GT2. The switch to the all-new PlayStation 2 for Gran Turismo 3 heralded much more detailed models, requiring much more time to create. This resulted in the Great Car List Purge. The total number of cars was trimmed from well over 600 in GT2 down to just 180 in GT3. But amazingly, despite pretty much all of the other obscure and low-volume cars from GT2 not making the cut, the ZZS did. At this point, the car was no longer even being made, with just over 200 models being produced from 1996 to 2000. And yet here it was, alongside the road car version of its supposed successor, the ZZ2, which never made it into production. And that solidified it in the series all the way up until Gran Turismo Sport in 2017. Frankly, there was a really good chance that had the ZZS not been chosen to return in GT3, it never would have featured in the series ever again. And to be honest, a timeline where the ZZS was not included in GT3 to GT6 is not a timeline that I want to live in. But regardless, when it comes to the real car, we're not done quite yet. The ZZ was briefly revived in 2002 under the Leading Edge sports car company. After Tommy Kyra ended production of the ZZ, the designs were sold off, and the car continued to be produced in the UK for a few more years in the early 2000s. There were actually two versions, the 190 RT and the 240 RT, with the number denoting the rough horsepower figure. The ZZ also acted as a basis for another car, the ASL Garaya. This car would also feature in Gran Turismo starting with GT4, but again sadly never made it into production. And finally, I should also mention the second generation ZZ. Yes, that's right, in 2015, the Tommy Kyra ZZ received a sequel. It was produced jointly with Green Lord Motors and took the form of an EV producing 300 horsepower from a single electric motor. Whilst it does have a shape vaguely similar with the original ZZ, its design is actually heavily based on the ZZ2 road car prototype, which is awesome because I personally think that was one of the best looking cars ever designed. Also, a modified version of the car was planned to appear at the 2020 Pikes Peak hill climb, but this was sadly aborted due to obvious reasons. Even still, it should be remembered for having one of the strangest rear wing placements of any car ever made. So that's the full legacy of the Tommy Kyra ZZ, a car which became well loved across the world. So what I'm going to do now is give my opinion on which GT game I believe the ZZS was truly at its peak. You could argue for GT2, its first ever appearance, or GT6, where it was a very competitive car at certain performance point levels, just like the ZZ2. Possibly even GT5, which was the only game in which the ZZS was ever a prize car, given out for getting all golds on the B license. But for me, peak ZZS has to be found in GT3. I think the decision to include the car in GT3 at all was inspired, and it feels like this game is the point where the ZZS really started to show its potential, as it's able to outperform far more powerful rivals. In all, it served as a quirky and unique alternative to the Lotus Elise, and with so few cars to choose from within the arena of ultralight sports cars in GT3, you really appreciate each of them even more. And for me, that's really what makes the difference for the ZZS in GT3 versus any of the other games it appeared in. For our next entry, let's hop over to Gran Turismo 4. When it comes to the cars, GT4 is somewhat similar to GT2. They both represented the second GT game of their respective console, and as such were able to build on top of the previous entry by adding far more content. In the end, the game launched with about 720 cars total, including plenty of new additions. In this sense, it's not surprising that this won't be the last time I mention GT4 in this video. The Hommel Berlinette is an almost perfect example of an obscure car which debuted in GT4. From its looks, to its performance, to even its name, it all just screams low-volume sports car. But do you know anything about the real Hommel Berlinette? Yeah, I thought not. Originally unveiled in 1994, the Berlinette was the brainchild of Michel Hommel, a former French racing driver and owner of a publishing empire. The story goes that Hommel, lamenting the lack of French sports cars at the time, asked the readers of his car magazine what their ideal sports car would look like. The response he got was for something along the lines of the original Alpine A110. Small, light, and rear-engined. So, that's what he made, with the exception of the rear engine parts, because in 1994, the mid-engined Hommel Berlinette Échappement was launched. In case you're wondering, Échappement means exhaust, and was actually the name of Hommel's magazine. The car was in essence a racer for the road, as it featured a roll cage, harnesses, and very few luxuries to speak of. There was even a track-only version known as the Barquette, which had its roof removed entirely. But this early version of the car probably looks a bit unfamiliar, and that's because it received a fairly major revision in 1999 to make the Berlinette RS. This version had its power upped from 155 horsepower to 167, as well as replacing the front and rear lights with new rounded ones. It's also worth mentioning that there was a restyled Berlinette Échappement shown off in 1997 by Sparrow, a Swiss engineering and design house created at the request of Michel Hommel. The Berlinette RS is the version that would appear in GT4, but there was later an updated RS2 model boasting 195 horsepower. The sad irony of this car is that by the time that GT4 actually came out, the Berlinette was already dead. It finished production at the end of 2003, and although there were rumours about it being revived by some Chinese investors, these came to naught. In terms of how this car appeared in Gran Turismo, there isn't too much to say about it. The Berlinette is one of those cars in which you could play through GT4 entirely and not even notice it was in the game. It wasn't given out as a prize car, and although it had decent performance, was quite overpriced for what it was, so there wasn't much reason to ever use it. But you could come up against the Berlinette in the championship for French cars, in which case it's actually one of the toughest opponents you'll find. The real-life Berlinette was designed for racing after all, so I guess that's not too surprising considering its competition. Anyway, here's some more interesting things about Michel Hommel. Did you know that he was the man responsible for bringing Bugatti back to Le Mans in 1994? He commissioned a Bugatti EB110 to be built to GT1 regulations and ran the car under his own name. But unfortunately it crashed out with less than an hour to go after a tyre failure. Still, at least it performed better than his next attempt in 1995. He commissioned an entirely new car to be built, this time an Aston Martin DB7 with a 6.3-litre V8, but his team failed to qualify for the race entirely. Anyway, back to the topic of the Berlinette. It featured in GT4, GT5 and GT6, but which game do I choose as its peak? Honestly, I would have to say GT5. And really, that's for one specific reason. In GT5, this car is granted as a prize for winning the World Compact Car Race event in A-Spec. Given that this is a level 1 event, and your opponents aren't particularly tough, it can be done very early in the game. This makes the Berlinette a very good, borderline broken prize car to be getting at this point in the career. If you have memories of driving this car in Gran Turismo, more likely than not, this would have been on GT5, given just how easy it was to obtain. But not only was it easy to obtain, it was also really useful. It was a solid choice for a number of events in the beginner and amateur league, and depending on your own skill, maybe even one or two in the professional league when fully tuned. Maybe it is a bit of an over-exaggeration to say that the Hommel Berlinette was made famous by Gran Turismo, but there's no doubt that it has been far more well remembered because of it. And thanks to GT5, it even managed to have its own day in the sun. You know what everyone loves about modern Gran Turismo? Really expensive cars. As in, like, cars costing tens of millions of credits that you have to grind for weeks for, which aren't really that good or can even be used for much in the game. Who doesn't enjoy that? But seriously, GT7 wasn't the first Gran Turismo to have insanely expensive cars. We need to turn to GT5 to find that. Before then, the most expensive cars you could find would normally be around 2 or 3 million credits, with the ultra-prestigious vintage models often instead being given out as prizes. But starting with GT5, there were a handful of models costing up to 20 million credits, which was also the maximum amount of credits that you could have at any one time. Our next entry is one of these 20 million credit cars. GT5 introduced 3 1960s Le Mans prototypes, the Ferrari 330 P4, Ford GT40 Mark IV, and the Jaguar XJ13. Now, both the Ford and Ferrari were already very well known thanks to their respective brands' fierce rivalry at the time, but the Jag stood out as a bit of an outsider. And this is because it never actually raced. Constructed in 1966, the XJ13 was intended to compete in the top prototype category alongside the aforementioned Ford and Ferrari. But by the time it was completed, it was already seen as obsolete when compared to its hypothetical rivals. The car was tested on 2 occasions in 1967, first at the Mirror test track, and secondly at Silverstone, where its drivers reported its inherent oversteer characteristics. The car was then shelved before finally being seen publicly at Mirror in 1971 on a promotional shoot for the Series 3 E-Type. But unfortunately, the car, which was being driven by Jaguar test driver Norman Dewis at the time, suffered a tyre failure at around 140 miles an hour and crashed heavily, almost destroying it completely, although the driver was miraculously unharmed. The damaged car was stored for close to 2 years before being fully restored and shown off in 1973. Fast forward to 2010, and the car would make its first ever video game appearance in GT5, shown off alongside what would have been its contemporary rivals back in the day, had it not been canned. In GT5, there is even a trophy titled Dream Race, in which you must win a race with either the Ferrari, Ford, or Jag, with the other 2 cars present. Funnily enough, there is also an achievement in GT7 called 3 Legendary Cars, which requires you to own these same 3 cars, although the trophy's description is quite vague and misleading. Now, here's something interesting. The car in Gran Turismo is of course based on the rebuilt XJ13, but did you know that the original pre-mirror crash car was slightly different? Firstly, the wheel design was changed. This was because the wheels were damaged beyond repair in the accident, and the patterns which were used to make them had been thrown out. Also, the repaired car featured flared wheel arches, which the original didn't have. This was done to mimic what the car would have looked like had it actually competed at Le Mans, as wider arches would have been needed to fit wider tyres. Interestingly, there are some replicas of the XJ13 in its original pre-crash design. So how did this extremely elusive one-off prototype make its way into Gran Turismo in the first place? Well, the real XJ13 appeared at the 2009 Goodwood Festival of Speed, and, as luck would have it, so did Gran Turismo series producer Kazunori Yamauchi. He even drove the car himself, and it seems likely that from this came an agreement to scan the car and put it into the upcoming Gran Turismo 5. What's quite funny is that on Wikipedia, the main image on the article for the XJ13 is actually Kaz driving it at Goodwood in 2009. So the XJ13 featured in GT5, GT6, as DLC in GT Sport, and now in GT7. But which game was its peak? Well, I think this one is fairly obvious, but again I'm going for GT5, its debut. This is probably when the car was most relevant and had the biggest spotlight placed on it. Unlike its fellow 20 million credit contemporaries, the XJ13 can also be won as a prize car from the Indy 500 A-Spec endurance race, so it's arguably the most attainable of the three. It features as an opponent in a handful of events in GT5, most notably the historic Car Cup, but also even in the Gran Turismo World Championship, where it can be a fairly tough rival. There was also the XJ13 Chrome line, which was a version of the car with a special livery that could only be obtained by taking part in a Facebook minigame in Europe, or as part of a free DLC pack which was very briefly available in Japan. It has to be said that the XJ13 was reasonably well known before GT5, but I believe the way it was given equal spotlight with the Ford and Ferrari has elevated it beyond simply being a race car that never raced. For a while, Gran Turismo was the only game where this car could be driven, but it was also included in Forza Horizon 5's Car Pass back in January 2022. Still, we have to give credit to Gran Turismo for adding to a legend that sadly never was. Back in the days before Gran Turismo could get the likes of Ferrari or Lamborghini in their games, they had to get creative when it came to their high-performance exotic road cars. Of course, everyone knows about Roof being used as an alternative to Porsche, but you could also consider the Venturis of GT2 to be like a low-rent French Ferrari, or Vector as an American Lamborghini that was somehow even more erratic than the real thing. But with GT4, they managed to find an even better Lamborghini alternative, the Cizeta V16T. Announced in Los Angeles in 1988, the V16T was envisioned as a supercar that had never been seen before. The name V16T refers to its colossal V16 engine, which was made out of two Lamborghini Huracan V8s that were joined together with a single crankshaft. It's also quite well known that the design of the V16T was based on the original design of the Lamborghini Diablo by Marcello Gandini that went unused. However, this is only half true. The front end is based on Gandini's original drawings, but the rear was heavily modified, in part due to the transversely fitted V16. When it came to GT4, the Cizeta is often viewed as a bit of a pig to drive. You can win it from completing the Supercar Festival event, so it's fairly easy to get. But the irony is that once you've completed the Supercar Festival, you won't really have any use for it. Even then, it's not exactly the most competitive car if you go back and replay that event either. I have to say that from my own experience of driving it in GT4, the mockery of the V16T is a bit overblown. It certainly isn't great, but it's not terrible either. I mean, who would really expect a mid-90s 16-cylinder supercar built by a startup company to actually be good? Well, apparently in real life they were built to a very high standard, so maybe GT4 just doesn't do it justice. You will sometimes hear the Cizeta referred to as the Cizeta Moroder. This is because the V16T was originally conceived as a joint venture by Claudio Zampoli, whose name gives the initials Cizeta in Italian, and Giorgio Moroder, a former music producer who was most prominent in the 70s and 80s. Zampoli and Moroder fell out over a dispute surrounding the production of the car, which resulted in the two parting ways. As such, only the original prototype, Chassis 001, is badged as a Cizeta Moroder, with the subsequent 13 production models simply being known as Cizetas. The one featured in Gran Turismo is a 1994 model, most likely one of the handful of cars that were exported to Japan. So, in which game did we witness peak Cizeta? Something that's notable is that in each of the numbered games it's featured in, GT4, GT5 and GT6, the V16T has always been a prize car. Like I said, you could get it from the Supercar Festival in GT4, but also the A-Spec MR Sports Cup in GT5, and then for getting all golds on the 4th set of events at the Goodwood Festival of Speed in GT6. So with that said, I'm actually going to pick GT6 as my choice here. When talking about the previous cars on this list that were carried across from the PS2 era, they remained as standard PS2 models with just minor revisions. Although this was the case for the Cizeta in GT5, for GT6 it was actually fully remodeled into a premium car. And not only that, it was one of the 25 cars available in a special 15th anniversary edition livery that were given out for pre-ordering GT6 or buying the 15th anniversary edition, almost all of which being new premium cars in GT6. It's fair to say that the Cizeta got quite a lot of love in this game. It also received some pretty cool unique aero options. And I also feel like the handling was noticeably better, at least compared to GT4. Still not amazing, but certainly more usable. Anyway, to me, this all shows that by GT6, the Cizeta had transcended its original purpose as a Lamborghini alternative, and was now being appreciated for what it was in its own right. This point is further driven home by the fact that the Lamborghini Diablo road car made its debut in GT6. So it would have been all too easy for them to have left the Cizeta as a standard car, buried away in the 1200 strong car list, but I'm so glad they didn't. The fact that it received this unexpected premium update in GT6 has given people hope that it one day may return to the series. But even if it doesn't, there may be another, far more costly way to get your hands on one. You see, the Cizeta website is still up and running, with a page where you can leave your details to order a brand new V16T. Zampoli stated in an interview in 2018 that the V16T is still available, of course on special order only. But with his passing in 2021, it's unknown if this is still the case. The most recent Cizeta to be built was this convertible all the way back in 2003. So if you're watching this video and have a spare $800,000 lying around, why not head over to CizetaAutomobile.com/order and get in touch. If you're a fan of Gran Turismo, or just cars in general, then I think it's only the right thing to do. The Group C prototypes of the 80s and early 90s were some of the most fearsome race cars that we have ever seen. It seemed like every major brand took a turn at developing their own, or at least outsourcing it to another company and then slapping their own engine in it. Through this, we witnessed the creation of some of the most iconic racing machines ever. Gran Turismo 4 was the game in which these types of cars became a major part of the series. In GT4, there were 7 Group C prototypes in total, but if you were to ask most players, there would always be one that stood out from the rest. The Minolta Toyota 88CV. Now, why was this? Well, there's quite a few reasons actually. The most obvious one being pure speed. This car is commonly seen as the outright fastest Group C prototype, and therefore the second fastest car in the entire game, behind only the Formula GT. And not only are we talking about its pace over a single lap, but also top speed. The Minolta has over 900 horsepower out of the box, but can be tuned to over 1200 in GT4. This, combined with its aerodynamic properties, results in a car that is capable of in excess of 350 miles per hour, and that is faster than anything else in this game. So, there we are, the ultimate Group C prototype of GT4. But there is something very strange about the Minolta. To demonstrate this, what you're seeing is a selection of the Minolta's Group C rivals in GT4, and their numerous real-life accomplishments. Now let's take a look at the Minoltas. Yes, as many sports car history nerds like myself will be dying to tell you, in real life, the Minolta achieved the square root of nothing. So, let me explain why. Toyota had been around in Group C since pretty much the very beginning, but without a huge amount of success, other than a handful of wins in the domestic All-Japan Sports Prototype Championship. For 1988, they developed a new car, the 88CV. Up until then, every Group C Toyota had been powered by an inline-4 engine, but the 88CV would instead be fitted with an all-new 3.2-litre V8. Despite the name, the car was a completely new design which was separate from the standard 88C, which also competed in 1988. If you look at the car's results, you will see that it had 4 entries across 3 races in 1988, with a best finish of just 16th. From this, many would look and consider the car a complete failure, but that would be ignoring some very key details. In its first ever race, the Fuji 500 miles, the car qualified 7th, but soon made its way into the lead of the race. And it stayed there for some time before a turbo problem caused it to lose speed and eventually retire. Still, it did manage the 3rd fastest lap time of any car in the race, and even lasted longer than both the 88C and 87C, which were also present. If you ask me, that's not a bad showing for a completely brand new car. Later, at the Suzuka 1000 kilometers, the car would qualify 3rd, and ran strongly in the top 3 for the early part of the race. Sadly, more engine troubles meant it lost considerable time, but it did still finish 16th and last of the classified finishers. The silver lining was that it was able to set the 2nd fastest lap of the race. And then the car's final outing was at the Fuji 1000 kilometers. This time, 2 88CVs were entered, the usual number 36 Minolta car, but also the number 37 Taka Q sponsored machine. The number 37 qualified 16th, but the number 36 was 5th. This was especially impressive, given that the Fuji 1000 doubled as a round of the World Sports Prototype Championship, and so 5th place meant that they had managed to out-qualify even a handful of works cars from Jaguar and Sauber Mercedes. In the race, they unfortunately lacked pace and quickly dropped down, and further mechanical issues resulted in the number 36 finishing behind the number 37, in 22nd and 21st places respectively. Again, their single lap pace was solid, as was proven by the number 36 putting in the 6th fastest lap of the race despite their struggles. After this race, the 88CV was retired and replaced with the 89CV, which evolved the same concept. So yes, the 88CV didn't achieve a whole lot, but you can see from its individual performances that the car was far from a no-hoper. It served more as a testbed for Toyota's new V8 than anything else. Sadly, it never raced at Le Mans, with the more proven 4-cylinder 88C competing there instead. It showed immense one-lap speed, particularly at the power-sensitive Fuji Speedway, so maybe its depiction in GT4 isn't too far off the mark. Fortunately, Gran Turismo has never simulated reliability, which was the car's biggest weakness. I guess the question really is, why did Polyphony choose this car over the far more successful and well-known Toyota Group C cars? Surely something like the TS010 or 94CV would have been more obvious choices, given that they both finished as runner-up at Le Mans. Even the 89CV managed to win a couple of races in Japan. No one can say for certain, but the most common theory is that the 88CV was chosen simply out of convenience. When a car is chosen to be included in Gran Turismo, a physical version of that car is usually needed for reference images, engine sound, and various other data. It's believed that the 88CV was chosen simply because it was easy to find and use for referencing, as opposed to any historical significance like with its contemporaries. In Gran Turismo, there are a couple of other interesting things about the Minolta. One is its name. The nickname Minolta that I've been using throughout this video is what the car is commonly referred to in the context of Gran Turismo. But did you know that this is what it was often called in real life? Just listen to some of the Japanese commentary from back when it raced. Minolta Toyota. Of course, Minolta is in reference to the car's titled sponsor, but this is likely why the car's official name in GT4 has its sponsor at the start rather than the manufacturer, something that is not true for most other race cars in this game. The other interesting point is the car's in-game year, 1989. Of course, the real 88 CV was built and competed in 1988, so where did 89 come from? Was it simply a mistake? Well, the real reason is a little bit more complicated. When the car was retired and then put on display, a couple of the sponsor logos were changed to bring it in line with the 89 CV that was actually racing. The car in Gran Turismo is the one with the replaced sponsors, so it's actually depicting the car in its preserved state, hence it being labelled as a 1989 model instead of 1988. Alright, so the decision of which game represented peak Minolta is a pretty obvious one. It's GT4. Aside from being one of, if not the fastest prototype, it is also one of the easiest to obtain in this game. All you have to do is win the El Capitan 200 miles endurance race. This event only requires a National A license and can be done with a reasonably fast road car, so the barriers to entry are quite low. The only real roadblock is that to unlock the endurance races, you do have to complete 25% of the game already. But trust me, it'll be worth it. Of course, the Minolta being so fast has the alternate effect of it being a really tough opponent. If it appears in the Gran Turismo World Championship, it will most likely be your biggest rival in terms of pure speed. However, in the hands of the AI, the car has marginally worse tyre wear than most of the other prototypes, meaning that at many tracks it has to do an extra pit stop. This fact means that despite its incredible speed, the Minolta often won't be your closest rival in the championship. As a player though, we can of course achieve a lot more with this car. Remember how I said the Minolta was second in speed only to the Formula GT? Well, in GT4 and also GT3, you can use any car you want to in the Formula GT World Championship. And with the right driver, it's actually possible to beat the Formula GT cars with an upgraded Minolta. Now that's what I call asserting dominance. The car also appears in both GT5 and GT6, where it is still brutally fast. But the introduction of cars like the Red Bull X2010 and later the SRT Tomahawk does kind of make the ranking of the fastest cars in those games completely trivial. In GT5, it is also given as a prize for completing the high speed like the wind event in A-Spec, which I think is very fitting. So there we are, the Minolta Toyota 88 CV. A car which was almost certainly destined to be a footnote in Group C history, but thanks to Gran Turismo has become one of the most beloved cars of the era. This, if anything, really highlights the power of these games to change people's perceptions of certain cars. Because even if it was never able to show its true potential on the racetrack, there's no doubt that we were able to witness it on the virtual ones instead. Many weird and wonderful cars have graced this series over the years, but the Chaparral 2J is one of them that needs no introduction. The story of it has gone down in racing folklore. Its unusual appearance, combined with an innovative design that featured a snowmobile engine powering two fans that effectively sucked the car to the track, was truly unforgettable. Unfortunately, the car itself wasn't able to achieve much success before being outlawed from the Can-Am series where it competed, but its design has gone on to influence countless more cars. Even current-day Formula 1 machines can trace their ground effect aerodynamics back to the 2J. This car debuted in GT4, and right from the start it was always a fan favourite. Not only did it look like nothing else, but it was actually a shockingly good car that was capable of mixing it with the fastest prototypes. And yes, that does include even the mighty Minolta. One of its best features was its traction out of corners, as it had far less wheel spin than most of its rivals, and this allowed it to have really good tyre life also. The car was equally as impressive in GT5 and GT6, and then it reappeared in GT7. Initially it was quite a handful in this game, but as updates improved the handling model, the 2J just became better and better, until today where it stands once again as a very solid race car. In the right hands, it can mix it with the prototypes just like in the older games. But it would be completely wrong to say that Gran Turismo made the 2J famous. The 2J being the way it is made the 2J famous. Gran Turismo merely exposed it to a wider audience. But within the Chaparral dealership, you'll find another car which I think fits that description far better. The Chaparral 2D. Most know the 2D as the other Chaparral in Gran Turismo, but I'm here to tell you that it too has a fascinating story, and one that is told far less often. Chaparral itself was founded as a constructor in 1962, and competed in various sports car races across North America. For 1966, they decided that they would build a car to the International Group 6 regulations. This was the 2D, and it was actually Chaparral's first ever closed cockpit car. Making the car comply to Group 6 regs meant that it could be entered in major endurance races across the globe. Almost immediately the car showed speed, qualifying second for the Daytona 24 Hours. Sadly, reliability would be a problem, with the car failing to finish, and the same would be true in the following race at Sebring, where 2 cars were entered. But then came the Nürburgring 1000 kilometers. Again, the 2D qualified second, behind only a works Ferrari 330 P3. But it would be the Ferrari that suffered mechanical troubles and retired, paving the way for the 2D to take the checkered flag after roughly 7 hours of racing. This was not only Chaparral's first major endurance win, but also their first international win, and all at no less a circuit than the fearsome Nürburgring. This alone marks the 2D as one of Chaparral's most important race cars, and one of only 2 of their cars to win an international endurance race, the other being its successor, the 2F, which won at Brands Hatch the following year. In its 7 starts, the only time the 2D reached the finish was at the Nürburgring. The car did compete at Le Mans in 1966, where it qualified a respectable 10th, and as the only non-Ford or Ferrari in the top 20, and was briefly used at the start of 1967 before being replaced with the 2F. In Gran Turismo, the car appeared alongside the 2J in GT4 through 6, but its peak had to be its debut game. Something that you could find in the older GT games is this type of environmental storytelling, which I like to call event storytelling. The basic idea is that in some in-game events, through the details of the events like the tracks, the opponent cars, and the prize car given, the game is taking influence from real life and referencing that in the event itself. I think the Chaparral 2D has one of the best examples of this. So in GT4, there are 2 endurance races taking place at the Nürburgring, the 4-hour and the 24-hour. The 4-hour is intended for road cars, however your prize for winning it is, guess who, the Chaparral 2D. At least in the international versions of the game, because fun fact, Chaparral was not included on the original Japanese version of GT4. But then in the 24-hour race, you may encounter the 2D as one of the opponents, in which case it will be easily your toughest rival. We can now see how they're referencing the car's real-life history in a very subtle and interesting way. Sadly, this level of subtlety has fallen out of favour in recent games, with a far more direct approach taken instead, but these types of sly references are the sort of things that really made me love Gran Turismo in the first place. For me personally, the Chaparral 2D is one of the cars that I wish was made premium in the PS3 era the most. It would have fit perfectly with the aforementioned big 3 from Ferrari, Ford, and Jaguar, and not to mention that it was absolutely beautiful to look at. Of course, it still featured as a standard car, but it was merely shunted into used car dealership obscurity. It was no longer a prize car and had its price inflated from 1.1 million credits in GT4 to 12.2 million in GT5. Weirdly, it then came back down to 3.7 million in GT6, so that's something. Funnily enough, the 2D shares quite a few similarities with the Minolta when it comes to its real-life racing exploits, with the exception of that one big win at the Nürburgring. So it's not at all surprising that the 2D has been overlooked in favour of the far more radical 2J. In GT4 they cost almost the same amount, so why would anyone pick the 2D? But whilst it doesn't have the same wow factor as the 2J or many of Chaparral's other race cars, the 2D is arguably the most important car they ever made. This was the car that put Chaparral on the map. So without it, Chaparral as a brand may never have featured in Gran Turismo at all. So if you like the 2J, but have pretty much all but forgotten the 2D, you can still appreciate what this car achieved, and what it made possible for one of the most influential racing teams of the 20th century. For the sake of this video, I've tried to avoid mentioning any concept cars. The reason for this is that concept cars are supposed to be forgotten almost by design. As such, when a concept car is featured in Gran Turismo, something which has happened many times, it's always a pretty familiar story. But for this last entry, I'll be making an exception. That's because the story of this concept car, and how it made its way into Gran Turismo, is really fascinating. Take your minds back to the Tokyo Game Show in September of 2010. Anticipation was building for the imminent release of Gran Turismo 5 in November, but there was still plenty of details to be revealed. It was here where a few of the social features under the Community tab were announced, but there were also a few new cars shown off too. The GT by Citroën race car was seen for the first time, and so were the German World War II vehicles, the Volkswagen Kübelwagen and Schwimmwagen. This was already a pretty interesting mixture of vehicles, but it was about to get even stranger. This is the Isuzu 4200R. Making its video game debut, the 4200R was a concept shown off by Isuzu at the 1989 Tokyo Motor Show. It was a 4-door mid-engine sports car powered by a Lotus-derived 4.2-litre V8. But despite all of that, its most striking feature had to be its styling. It was a very flowing design that looked nothing like what Isuzu had produced before. Take the boxy Piazza and Gemini for example. It seemed to be an indication of Isuzu's future design direction. But despite the calls from many to put the car into production, it sadly never was. But worse was yet to come. In 1993, it was decided that Isuzu would focus solely on SUVs and commercial vehicles. Not seeing any reason to keep it around, the 4200R was destroyed, never to be seen again. After that, all we had to remember the car by were the handful of images taken when it still existed. But now fast forward to 2009. Kazunori Yamauchi was attending the Pebble Beach concourse where he would be part of the judging panel. In addition to this, he would be handing out the Gran Turismo award for a particular vehicle that he saw as exceptional, a tradition that began the previous year. In the end, he chose an Alfa Romeo Giulia TZ2 as the winner, and this car would go on to be immortalized in Gran Turismo the following year. But that wasn't the only car that would end up in GT5 as a result of him attending the show. Another judge of the event was Shiro Nakamura, the then Chief Creative Officer at Nissan. As it turns out, Nakamura had previously worked at Isuzu and was heavily involved in the design of the 4200R. Coincidentally, Kaz himself was present at the 1989 Tokyo Motor Show and saw the car in person. As they discussed this, they soon came to an idea. Why not bring the 4200R back to life by featuring it in Gran Turismo? And so it was decided. Using solely reference images, and with Nakamura himself watching over the process, the 4200R was successfully reborn in GT5. By the way, Shiro Nakamura retired in 2017, but he actually appears in GT7 as one of the designers you'll find at the cafe, who lends his thoughts about certain cars. The 4200R is a very unique concept car in Gran Turismo. It is one of the only concept cars that was added to the game long after the real thing had first been shown. One of the few other examples of this is with the Mitsubishi HSR2, which debuted in GT4, and coincidentally was also first seen at the 1989 Tokyo Motor Show. So that's the whole convoluted story. But if I'm being honest, the 4200R in Gran Turismo is a bit of a disappointment. From that big V8, it only makes 300 horsepower, and yet it weighs 1500 kilos. The performance isn't terrible, it's just that from looking at it, you would expect a bit more. But still, it's amazing that this car even featured in Gran Turismo at all. As for its peak game, there isn't much to choose between GT5 and GT6, but I'll go with the former. The car is given out for getting all golds on the A license, which adds a bit of reverence to it, but aside from that, it doesn't feature too heavily in the main career. It's worth mentioning that Isuzu created an even more outlandish concept a couple of years later, known as the Isuzu Como. It was a pickup truck / ute style thing that had a similar design language to the 4200R. It was also powered by a Formula 1 V12 that had been tested by Team Lotus. Yes, really. Sadly, in spite of its cool backstory and incredible looks, the 4200R is kind of forgettable in these games. But even still, through this car, the power of Gran Turismo has been shown once again. Not only can it launch cars into stardom, but it can even bring them back from the dead. And that brings us to the end of another chapter of memorable Gran Turismo cars. You might have been able to tell, but some of these cars I've wanted to talk about for a very long time, and I'm glad that I finally got the opportunity to do so. With that said, there are still more cars from this series that I feel are worth highlighting. So, let me know in the comments what type of cars you want me to cover in future videos, and I may just do so. But for now, thanks for watching, and have a good one. I think now is the time that we finally talk about the big hitters. The cars that have become almost synonymous with Gran Turismo itself. Yes, I've already covered quite a number of cars from Gran Turismo on this channel, coming in all shapes and sizes. Cars that have become loved, cars that have become hated, and cars that are just plain goofy. But now, we're taking on the cream of the crop. I've discussed the cars that Gran Turismo has made famous, but what about the cars that arguably put Gran Turismo itself on the map? Models that have become so intrinsic to the fabric of the series that to not include them in these games would seem unthinkable. This is what we're handling today. Now, some of these cars may seem too obvious to even mention, but I assure you, they have some fascinating stories to tell, both in real life and with how they tie into Gran Turismo lore. There's no more of a surefire way to make a Gran Turismo icon than to have it be the hero car of one of these games. Our first case is possibly the best example of this that you'll find. The Ford GT is a car that needs no introduction, but I'll give it one anyway. It's the successor to the original Ford GT, better known as the GT40, that won the Le Mans 24 Hours on 4 occasions in the 1960s. But let's talk about how it appeared in Gran Turismo. As many of you will already know, the Ford GT was the hero car of Gran Turismo 4, as shown by the box art of the game. At the time, the car was completely new, with production of it only starting in the middle of 2004. Despite this, it had already appeared in the series thanks to Gran Turismo Concept in 2002. The pre-production version of the car was featured here, looking very similar to the final model. One very direct way in which the Ford GT ties into Gran Turismo is through series producer Kazunori Yamauchi. He actually owns a GT in real life. Now that in and of itself isn't too surprising. He's owned many different cars, including a Nissan GT-R, Porsche 911 GT3, and Honda S2000, among many others. But what is interesting is that he actually owned 2 GTs. This is something that he explained himself in a bonus video from Gran Turismo 5 Prologue, as well as the fact that he considered the GT to have the best body design in the history of automobiles. Now that is what I call a compliment. Given all of this, it is not at all surprising to see the GT have such prominence in the series. But beyond the standard road car, there is another version of it that is even more iconic to these games. Taking a look at the intro movie to GT4, you'll find this, the Ford GT LM race car. This is an entirely fictional version of the GT created by the Gran Turismo team, and it's most likely the car that you first picture when thinking about GT4. It predated the real Ford GT competing in any professional series. The first of those was in the GT300 class of Super GT in 2006, campaigned by DHG Racing. It's worth noting that at one point there was a yellow livery planned for this car, as shown very briefly in a DVD that came with the Asia exclusive Gran Turismo 4 The Bible guidebook. Another oddity would be the driver names. They seem to be copied from the Mercedes CLK LM, as they show Klaus Ludwig and Ricardo Zonta, the two real-life drivers of the number 2 Mercedes in the 1998 FIA GT Championship. Anyway, even though the road car is the one that appears on the cover, to me, and I suspect many others, the LM race car has always been the true hero car of GT4. Beyond the intro, it just seemed to have more of a presence in the game. And of course, it is the prize car given for winning the GT World Championship. Personally, I think this was the perfect choice. I've mentioned the odd driver names, but what about the racing number? Number 4. It's pretty self-explanatory, right? Number 4 for Gran Turismo 4. Well, yes, but actually there's also another more overlooked meaning. Consider this. This car is called the Ford GT LM Race Car Spec 2. Back in GT Concept, along with the concept road car, you could also find the original GT LM race car. Back then, it was known as the Ford GT Concept LM. This car is often forgotten, as the Spec 2 came along and stole its thunder. But also, aside from its livery, it looks pretty much identical to the regular concept car. As far as GT original race cars go, this was a pretty basic one. But what's important to note is that it too sports the number 4. This was long before GT4 had been announced, so the use of 4 in this case was actually in reference to the original GT40's 4 consecutive wins at the Le Mans 24 Hours. Of course, the throwback Golf livery is also part of this. If we then skip past GT4 onto GT5 Prologue, we can find this, the Ford GT LM Spec 2 test car. It once again bears the number 4, and with no possible relation to GT4, that confirms the true meaning of the number once and for all. Another interesting point is that the Spec 2 race car was still based on the concept version. This is most obvious by looking at its headlight design. The Spec 2 test car, on the other hand, was based on the final production model. Each of these cars would appear in GT5 and GT6, but sadly, neither the concept LM nor the Spec 2 race car would appear in GT Sport, but the test car would be added in an update during 2018. Of course, this was most likely because the test car was already a full PS3 quality premium car, whereas the other two were just ported over PS2 models. However, for Gran Turismo 7, the iconic Spec 2 race car made a return. It was now heavily based on the test car, as shown by the production car headlight design and the tow hook location being the same. However, the two weren't identical. Aside from the livery, the test car has front canards, which the race car doesn't, and each have a slightly different rear wing design. Despite now being fully based on the production model, there is one small detail still carried over from the concept car. This is the wheel design. Both the test car and the Spec 2 race car have always used the wheel design from the concept, for whatever reason. With the race car's reappearance in GT7, they also finally updated the driver names to now show Kazunori Yamauchi and Yukiharu Taniguchi, who worked on the opening movie of GT4. As far as I can tell, they never worked on another GT game after this, so that's an interesting throwback. The Ford GT LM, in any of its 3 forms, has always been a very solid car. In events like the Dream Car Championship, for example, it's always one of the toughest opponents, and a very strong choice should you decide to use it. Being a GT original race car makes it quite unique among the other iconic cars from this series. Sure, there have been other memorable ones, like the Mitsubishi GTO LM, Pagani Zonda LM, or even something more recent like the Peugeot RCZ Group 3. But none of them have left a legacy as strong as the Ford GT LM. There is a reason why it is the only pre-GT5 original race car to have returned to the series. But even if it were to never catch on with the players of these games, I feel like they still would have brought it back anyway. Why? Well, no reason in particular. I think that Gran Turismo 3 is a good place to determine what counts as an iconic Gran Turismo car. You see, after Gran Turismo 2 featured more than 600 models, GT3 was scaled back to not even 200. Despite this, it still contained many cars that people would consider as particularly memorable, be them already established fan favourites, or exciting newcomers. The point being that any car that made it into GT3 had some sort of value and reason for appearing. If you've fully played through this game, you will likely know about what I call the Big Three. These are the 3 toughest opponent cars you'll find in the entire game, outside of the F1 machines. They mostly appear in the late game championships, but each of them have an interesting story. Let's start with the Nissan R390 GT1. This car is often not the outright fastest of the big 3 when they all appear together, but it's still pretty damn quick. It seems to not wear out its tyres too much, and so can complete some races without needing to make a pit stop. That is unless you race at Laguna Seca, where it does its best impression of the Shelby Cobra. This car debuted in GT2. Not only did the more familiar 1998 version appear, but also the black and red 1997 car. Although from GT3 onwards, only the 98 would appear alongside its road car counterparts. There isn't too much to say about the road car, other than the fact that it has always been somewhat underpowered at around 350 horsepower. Officially, this is what Nissan rated the car at, but it's believed that it actually produced more, around the 550 horsepower figure, just like the race car. Either way, this is how it was represented in Gran Turismo. But in GT3, the race car would also have an error. It only weighed 900 kilograms, compared to its actual weight of 1000 kilos. This would be corrected in future games, but it does help to explain why it's so fast in GT3. In GT4, the R390 would be one of only a handful of cars to receive a secret black variant that would appear in the used dealership for only a few in-game days. The real-life car was developed jointly by Tom Walkinshaw Racing and Nismo in 1997. It was designed to GT1 regulations, as the name suggested, hence why one road-going example had to be built. It was actually partly based on the design of the Jaguar XJ13, which had previously been developed by Tom Walkinshaw Racing. The car only competed on 2 occasions, once at Le Mans in 1997 and again at Le Mans in 1998. In 1997, Nissan entered 3 cars, with the leading car starting the race in 3rd. Unfortunately, all 3 cars suffered with gearbox issues, and only one car was able to finish down in 12th. 1998 was much better though. Qualifying was not as strong as the lead car was only 10th. But in the race, many of their competitors had reliability issues. This allowed the number 32 car to finish in 3rd, behind only the 2 Works Porsches, and impressively, the other 3 Nissans all finished in the top 10 as well. After this, the R390 was retired and replaced with the R391 Le Mans prototype. In the realm of Gran Turismo, the R390 has been somewhat overlooked in favour of the other 2. It also appeared in GT5 and GT6, but only as a standard PS2 model, and since then it hasn't returned. It's kind of a sad end when you think about its peak appearance in GT3. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have the Mazda 787B. The 787B was the only Group C prototype to appear in GT3, and therefore the first ever Group C car in Gran Turismo. From that, you might expect it to be overpowered, given what we would see in future games, but this isn't at all the case. It's actually pretty balanced with the other 2. This car is famously won from the Like the Wind event, meaning that it isn't too difficult to get. You just need a road car with a load of power. I suppose the discussion around the 787B's real-life story is always a popular topic, so we might as well cover it. Mazda had been competing in endurance racing for a while, but without a huge amount of success. They were able to achieve some class victories at Le Mans, on account of often being the only cars in the IMSA GTP class, but they were able to finish 7th overall in 1987 and again in 1989. For 1990, they introduced the 787, featuring a 3-rotor engine dubbed the R26B. The new car was considerably faster than the old 767, but neither of the two cars were able to finish at Le Mans, leaving the 767 to once again win the GTP class as the only car left running. For 1991, the 787 would evolve into the 787B. Now, there are two common trains of thought when it comes to the 787B. Either it was a beast of a car that exploited a loophole in the rules, meaning it had to be banned, or it was a complete failure that somehow lucked into a win at the most prestigious race of the year. As with most things, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. The 787B was never quick over one lap, there's no denying that. But it did have solid race pace on account of its fuel efficiency, and being kind on its tyres thanks to its low weight. This is a quirk that is also evident in Gran Turismo when compared to the other Group C cars. And ultimately, it was these factors, along with incredible reliability that its competitors seemed to lack, that helped it secure an unbelievable victory at Le Mans. The winning car was the number 55 machine that was entered as a one-off, hence why it ran a completely different livery to the two regular cars which came home in 6th and 8th places. In case you're wondering, Renown was a Japanese clothing company that supplied race suits to the team. Sadly, they filed for bankruptcy in 2020, but even still, their name will forever be immortalized on the side of that Le Mans winning 787B. Like the R390, this car would also have a secret black variation in GT4, but unlike the R390, it had a much better fate thereafter. It was rebuilt as a full PS3 spec premium model in GT5, the only Group C car to get that treatment. It also returned as DLC in GT Sports, and was then carried through into GT7. Here's some interesting points. In GT3, this car is incorrectly labelled as a turbo. This was corrected in GT4, but when it returned in GT5, it featured made-up driver names in place of where the real ones should be. This was eventually corrected when it came back in GT Sports. So then, let's tackle the final of the big three. To me, the Toyota GT1 is the most iconic of these three cars. Not the most iconic generally, that would have to be the 787B, but the most iconic to Gran Turismo. Once again, this car debuted in GT2 with two versions, the 1998 spec and the 1999 spec. They were two of the fastest cars in that game as well, but only the latter would return in GT3. In terms of pure speed, the GT1 is on average probably the fastest of the three, but it does suffer from worse tyre wear. Outside of being an opponent, it's also known for the final test of the Super License, where the player is tasked with beating a lap time in it at Monaco. This is often considered as one of the hardest license tests in Gran Turismo. It was also used in the final test of GT2, but this time at Apricot Hill. Another claim to fame this car had in GT3 is that it was often used to perform the wheelie glitch, given that it produced quite a lot of downforce which was necessary to pull it off. The other car that was more commonly used for this was the Pikes Peak Escudo, which I talked about earlier in this series. It too is one of the fastest cars in GT3, but fun fact, it never appears as an opponent anywhere in this game. Alongside the race car, GT3 also featured the GT1 road car. Visually, it just looks like the race car but without a livery, and performance-wise it's not that far off either. This is one of the few elusive models to not return in GT4 for unknown reasons. When it comes to the GT1 in real life, it was developed in 1998. It was built to GT1 regulations like the Nissan. Toyota famously got around the requirement for the car to have enough storage space for a standard briefcase by insisting that, in theory, it did have the space in the fuel tank. In their first attempt at Le Mans, they brought 3 cars, and managed to qualify one of them in second. Unfortunately, that leading number 28 car would crash out in the race, and the number 29 would suffer a gearbox failure when contending for the lead. The sole surviving number 27 car would finish down in 9th. For 1999, the GT regulations were changed, meaning that the GT1 was no longer eligible, so the car was adapted into the GTP prototype class. At Le Mans, Toyota would achieve a 1-2 lockout in qualifying. They were the odds-on favourites to win, but both cars suffered major tyre failures during the night, causing accidents that would force both to retire. The sole remaining number 3 car then went on a charge to catch the leading BMW, but it too suffered a high-speed blowout. In this case, it was at least able to keep going and came home in second place. But the story doesn't end there. The GT1 competed in a third and final race at the 1999 Fuji 1000 km. Its only real competition was a single Nissan R391 and a BMW V12 LM entered by Team Go. It was easily the favourites, once again qualifying on pole, but the team were given a penalty during the race for overtaking under a yellow flag. They could never make up the time they lost, and so were beaten by the inferior R391. And that ends the real-life story of the Toyota GT1, one of the fastest cars to never win a race. Just like the other 2 I'd mentioned, the GT1 also had a special black version in GT4. In fact, the big 3 make up most of these, with the Nissan R92CP, which was new to GT4, being the outlier. For a while, the GT1 seemed doomed to a similar fate as with the R390. It returned in GT5 and GT6, but was never remade as a PS3 premium model, and moving on to the PS4, it didn't come back. That was until earlier this year, when the GT1 made a triumphant return in GT7. To be honest, this was long overdue. To me, the Toyota GT1 is one of the cars that first comes to mind when I think of Gran Turismo. Of course, this being Gran Turismo 7, its return wasn't without confusion. This car was put into the Group 2 class, as opposed to Group 1 where the other prototypes are, like the 787B. It seems like this was done for the sake of continuity with the CLK LM and F1 GT-R, 2 cars that also competed in GT1 in 1998. Frankly, I would have just bumped up the power and put it in Group 1 anyway, but whatever. Now it races alongside stuff like the SC430 GT500, because sure, that makes sense. Anyway, a common trait you would have noticed is that each of these 3 were Japanese cars that competed for the overall win at Le Mans, with differing fortunes. The Nissan never really looked quick enough to do it, but still achieved 3rd in 1998. Also, through strong reliability, they managed to get all 4 of their works cars in the top 10 that year, which is actually incredibly impressive and something that doesn't get mentioned often enough. The Toyota was kind of the opposite. It easily had the pace in both 1998 and 1999, but was struck down by a combination of reliability issues and just sheer bad luck. The usual story for Toyota at Le Mans. And we all know about the Mazda. Reliability, consistency, and strategy were the pillars to its victory, and it became the first Japanese car to win Le Mans, and the very only all the way until 2018. So next time you come up against these cars in Gran Turismo, just remember that they each have an interesting story to tell. They are the Big 3. Or should I say, the Gran Turismo 3. You know what's a car that almost everybody loves? Debuting in Gran Turismo 2 was the TVR Speed 12. GT2 had many weird and wonderful vehicles, but the Speed 12 is always one that stood out. It truly looked like nothing else, and even more surprising was the fact that it was conceived as a road car that anyone could buy. The version seen in GT2 was the original concept car first shown at the British Motor Show in 1996, then known as the Project 712. It had a 7.7 litre V12 engine boasting over 800 horsepower. The reason why I say that almost everyone loves it is because if you've ever driven it in GT2, then you'll know that it's quite a handful. Near undrivable, some might say. I talked about this car back in my infamous cars video, and that was for one specific reason. This car can be won from the third race of the GT All-Stars event at Red Rock Valley. Given that it can be continuously won and then sold for 500,000 credits a pop, it represents easily the quickest way to make cash in this game, and possibly the most broken, repeatable money-making method in Gran Turismo history. But the story of the Speed 12 in this series goes a lot deeper than that. This car was conceived to compete in GT1, and even race at Le Mans as early as 1997. Sadly, this never happened, as the car was already obsolete when it arrived in 1998. It would have stood no chance against the likes of the Mercedes CLK LM, Porsche 911 GT1 98, or Toyota GT1, which were all purpose-built race cars, unlike the Speed 12. Even still, it would eventually compete in the GT1 class of the British GT Championship in 1998. In GT2, if you perform a racing modification on the Speed 12, it will turn into that very GT1 car that competed in British GT. In real life, the car only appeared a handful of times, but scored a best finish of 4th on debut. After that, the GT1 rule set was abandoned, as we've already discussed, and so the Speed 12 was left with nowhere to race. But in the meantime, TVR was still hard at work on producing the Speed 12 as a production car. In 2000, they would complete what was now known as the Cerbera Speed 12. The following year, this version would appear in Gran Turismo 3. It's fair to say that the Cerbera Speed 12 is more fondly remembered than the concept car, and I'd wager that Gran Turismo is a key reason why. I mean, who could forget its exaggerated styling, ridiculous colour options, and ludicrous speed? It was so quintessentially TVR. Despite being a road car, it can really hold its own against the race cars in GT3. Although the Cerbera was planned to go into full production, this never happened. It's a rather well-known story that the boss of TVR at the time, Peter Wheeler, drove one of the finished models home and declared that it was simply unusable on the road. After that, all of the orders that had already been placed on the car were cancelled. However, what's often forgotten is that the Cerbera Speed 12 also briefly competed in British GT. It was developed into a GT2 car for the 2000 season, and competed for 3 full years, achieving a decent amount of success. They notched up 3 wins and 15 further podiums against the likes of the Lister Storm, Marcos LM600, and Dodge Viper GTSR. In 2001, a second Cerbera GT2 was even built to compete in some rounds. A road-going Speed 12 was eventually sold a few years later, adapted from one of the race car chassis, as you can see. In Gran Turismo, the 2000 road car would go on to appear in GT4, GT5, and GT6. Sadly, it wasn't given a premium model in the PS3 games, but it was well known particularly in GT6 as one of the few cars that could go well over 300 miles an hour. Once again, this is another car that has yet to return to the series, even though it really should. It's because of Gran Turismo that we even remember the car in this form at all. The 2 examples of the car that still exist are based on the race car, featuring aggressive aero. And yet for many, the enduring image we have of the Speed 12 is the 2000 model that was in GT for so many years. It's quite telling that when the Speed 12 has appeared in other racing games, which has happened quite a few times, it's rarely ever the original concept or even the race car based existing one. Instead, it's the 2000 car, the one that was supposed to go into production but never did. And guess what? Gran Turismo was the very first to feature this particular model. Of course, when it comes to Gran Turismo, it's not just about the Speed 12. TVR as a whole became famous internationally as a result of appearing in the original Gran Turismo. You could even argue that these games are the reason why TVR started selling cars in Japan in the first place, and since then, the brand has gained a surprisingly large following in the country. Really, the Cerbera Speed 12 is just the figurehead, the unobtainable halo car that summed up what TVR was all about. Through this, it has firmly secured its place in Gran Turismo lore. Well, there's no getting around this. Now it's time to talk about the single most iconic car in Gran Turismo. The car that, no matter how many others they may include, will always be at the top of the pile. Ladies and gentlemen, the Toyota Castrol Tom Supra. What more can be said about this car? If any were to encapsulate Gran Turismo as a franchise, it has to be this one. Let's start with its real-life story. This car was campaigned by Team Toms in the 1997 All Japan GT Championship. Driven by Pedro de la Rosa and Michael Krum, they won 2 races that season and secured Toyota's first ever JGTC title. It was a close fight with Toyota stablemates Team Saad, but after both finishing on 67 points, Toms won it on countback. This already secured the car's place in history, but what happened after that, surely nobody could have expected. But first, let me ask you a question. Which was the first Gran Turismo game in which this car appeared? Simple enough, right? Well, the answer is Gran Turismo 5. Let me explain. The Castrol Supra has been almost ever present in this series from the very beginning. However, if we go back to the original Gran Turismo, you'll find this, the Toyota Castrol Supra GT. 1995 was the first time we would see the Castrol Supra when Team Toms entered the JGTC, securing the marque's first ever win in round 3. But the car that's actually depicted here is the 1996 Castrol Tom Supra. This car didn't achieve any wins, finishing 8th in the championship in a year where Team Go and their McLaren F1s dominated GT500. In GT1, the car, which appears front and center on the main menu, is not fully licensed, hence why it's known simply as the Castrol Supra GT with no mention of Toms. It also featured some alternate color schemes, those being white, blue and red, black, green and red, and black, blue and red. The black version was even given as a prize for winning the Grand Valley 300km endurance race, the marquee event of GT1. The car would return in GT2, where its alternate colour schemes would be removed, but it would also be joined by the 1999 Castrol Supra. In real life, this car was more successful than the 96, but less than the 97. It scored 2 wins and finished 2nd overall in the championship. This car would be fully licensed as the Castrol Tom Supra JGTC. Moving on to GT3, we would find the 2000 Castrol Tom Supra. Up until then, the Castrol Supras always had a decent presence in the game, but GT3 would be the first time that one would be cast as the hero car. It featured prominently in the game's intro movie, using a mixture of real-life footage and pre-rendered game footage. In-game, it could be purchased at the Toyota dealership for 1 million credits, or you could have a 1 in 4 chance of winning it from everyone's favourite event, the Professional Vitz Race Championship. Oh boy. The irony of them choosing this car to take centre stage in GT3 is that 2000 was a really bad year for Toms in GT500. The number 36 finished 17th in the standings, with a best finish of 5th all year, and its teammates didn't fare much better. The number 35 car was ranked 14th with a single podium, and the number 37 all the way down in 21st. It was a far cry from the Castrol Mugen NSX, the secondary hero car of GT3 if you will, which ended up as the series champion. Moving on to GT4, the 2000 car would be joined by its successor, the 2001 Castrol Tom Supra. This car first appeared in 2002's Gran Turismo concept, but most would recognise it from GT4. This car is somewhat forgotten as its livery no longer had the classic Castrol swoops, instead going with a more conventional gradient pattern. In real life, it did maintain the old livery until round 4 of the season, when it was then updated in line with Castrol's rebranding and their new logo. The car would once again achieve a best finish of 5th, with their highest ranked driver ending up in 12th overall. And as it would turn out, 2001 ended up being the final year that Castrol would be the title sponsor of Tom's number 36 car. But with GT5 in 2010, there would be a new Castrol Supra joining the fold. this is where the 1997 car finally comes in. It seems like the idea was to bring back a beloved car from the series past, fully rebuilt as a premium model. However, instead of choosing the 1996 car that appeared in GT1 and GT2, they chose the 1997 instead. You can understand the reasoning here. 1997 was the year that Gran Turismo first released in Japan, and of course this car won the GT500 championship that year. It just makes too much sense. Honestly, the bigger question is why they chose the 96 car for GT1 in the first place. This decision truly established the 1997 Castrol Tom Supra as the beloved icon that it is today. After missing out in GT Sport, the car reappeared in GT7. Once again, it was quite prominent, especially in trailers and various other marketing. It was even included as a bonus for those who pre-ordered the game. So that's the story of the Castrol Tom Supra in Gran Turismo. What appears as just a single car is actually 5 different model years. In fact, the only Castrol Tom Supras that have never appeared in this series are the 1995 and 1998 cars. Now, after 2001, Tom still competed in GT500 with different sponsors, and some of their later cars would go on to appear in this series as well. The Wood One Tom Supra was in GT4, 5 and 6, the Petronas Tom's SC430 from GT5 through to GT7, and the AU Tom's RCF in GT Sport and GT7. The Castrol livery is of course a big part of why this car is so memorable. This specific design was first seen back in 1993 on Toyota's Group A Celica rally cars, and it was recently resurrected to be used on a GR Yaris Rally 2 competing in the British Rally Championship. Most bizarrely, it was also recently used as a one-off in a Darlington NASCAR race by RFK Racing on Brad Keselowski's Ford Mustang, taking direct inspiration from the Supra. In some ways, you could consider the Toyota Minolta 88CV as a predecessor to the Castrol Supra. It too was run by Team Toms, bearing their number 36, and it competed in the Japan Sports Prototype Championship, what was Japan's top sports car series before the JGTC. That's a fun piece of trivia tying together 2 of Gran Turismo's most noteworthy cars. So the story of the Castrol Supra in Gran Turismo is probably a bit more convoluted than most would realise. But even still, one thing should be very clear. This is the car of Gran Turismo. There are many cars that we associate with these games, but none of them encapsulate what Gran Turismo is, or rather used to be, more than the 1997 Toyota Castrol Tom's Supra. Now, this is where the video would normally end, but I have just one more car that I'd like to talk about. It would be a complete contradiction to include a car in this video about Gran Turismo's iconic cars and say that it has been forgotten by most people. And yet, there is a single car that does fit both of those descriptions. Once again, let me ask you a question. When booting up the original Gran Turismo, what is the first car that players will ever see? Well, assuming you didn't skip the intro, it would be this, the Nismo GT-R LM road car. In fact, you see it 3 separate times before you see a single other car. But it wasn't just the road car in GT1, there was also the GT-R LM race car. This was one of the fastest cars in the game, and so a very tough opponent when it appeared in events like the GT World Cup. In real life, this car was created, once again, to take on the Le Mans 24 Hours. It was built to GT1 regulations, meaning that it had to be converted to rear-wheel drive. 2 cars were entered in 1995, with only one reaching the finish in 10th overall and 5th in the GT1 class. For 1996, they could only achieve 15th overall and 10th in GT1, before being replaced by the R390 GT1 for 1997. So the car wasn't very successful, but that didn't stop it from taking centre stage in Gran Turismo. It's also noteworthy that after beating the GT World Cup and receiving the end credits, the final scene before fading to black shows the GT-R LM race car driving over the hill into the sunset. It's quite symbolic. The game started with the road car being unloaded, and it ended with the race car driving off. If you ask me, the GT-R LM seemed to get a bigger spotlight than the Castrol Supra here. Of course, this was back before hero cars were really a thing in the series, but if I had to pick one for this game, I'd say it was the Nismo. For GT2, only the road car returned. This is because the race car became incorporated as the racing modification of the road car. Strangely enough, the car isn't playable in the Japanese version of GT2. This is because it doesn't appear in the Nissan dealership. It's believed that this was an error, as the car is still present in the files and appears in the international versions with no issues. But GT3 is where this car would really start to fade into the background. For one, only the road car made the transition. This was somewhat understandable, given that GT3 was limited in terms of content, and so cuts clearly had to be made. Sadly, it doesn't feature in this game very much. You can win it from a couple of higher end events, but it's very rarely seen in the game outside of that. Honestly, you could play through this entire game and not even realize it was included until right at the end. And that's a shame, because it's not as if the car had the performance to warrant that. It only had 300 horsepower, no all-wheel drive system, and it somehow weighed 1,580 kilograms. That is more than the standard R33 GT-R road car. And that's kind of how things stayed. The road car reappeared in GT4, 5 and 6, but the race car sadly never returned. I've always found this a rather bizarre decision. I mean, could you imagine them including the R390 road car, but not the race car? Which is the whole reason why it exists in the first place. It wouldn't make any sense. And given that the road car wasn't anywhere near as quick as it looked, and was also very overpriced, most people kind of forgot about it all too easily. It didn't help that it was a standard model, and not a particularly good one either. If they had chosen to bring the race car over, I think it would have been more fondly remembered. I mean, this car represents the only time that a GT-R has ever raced at Le Mans. Well, aside from the similarly named GT-R LM Nismo, but that's something else entirely. The car isn't too dissimilar to the R33s that competed in GT500. Visually, they look pretty close, have similar performance, and are also rear-wheel drive. But it's worth noting that none of them made it out of the PS1 era either. In that sense, the Nismo GT-R LM offers something that we don't have in current Gran Turismo, a thoroughbred rear-wheel drive racing variant of the R33 Skyline. If we have a look at the GT7 release date trailer from September 2021, we can find something very interesting. I've previously called this the nostalgia bait trailer, because of all of the clear references it makes to the intros of past GT games. And part of this is, of course, an homage to GT1's intro. But as we know, the GT-R LM didn't return in GT7 either. So for the shot mimicking the car being unloaded from the trailer, they instead used the Castrol Tom's Supra. Once again, this is pretty symbolic. It tells you all you really need to know about how the dynamic between these two cars shifted over time. So that was the story of the Nismo GT-R LM. A car that wasn't particularly noteworthy in real life, but thanks to these games, did briefly get some time in the spotlight. It is the near-forgotten legend of Gran Turismo.